In March 1952, Samuel Noah Kramer, working in the tablet collections of the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, encountered a fragment catalogued as NI 9602. The piece had been excavated from Nippur 40 years earlier during the joint expedition of the University of Pennsylvania and the Ottoman Imperial Museum, then stored without translation. It measured 11 centimeters by 8, broken on 3 sides, preserving only 23 lines of Sumerian text. Kramer identified it as part of a city lamentation, a composition mourning urban destruction. The preserved lines followed the expected pattern: descriptions of abandoned temples, silent streets, scattered populations. Standard lamentation vocabulary, formulaic phrases used across dozens of similar texts. Then, in line 17, the formula broke. The text stated, "The storm carried fire, but the fire did not burn the wood. The fire consumed the stone, but the wood remained." Kramer noted the passage in his publication, but offered no interpretation. The contradiction was visible in the Sumerian, gibil, fire, paired with verbs indicating consumption and transformation, but applied to materials in reverse of their expected behavior. Stone does not burn, wood does. Yet the text insisted otherwise, and did so not as metaphor or mythological flourish, but as direct description embedded in an otherwise conventional lamentation. The fragment was filed with hundreds of other lamentation pieces, catalogued, published in transliteration, and largely forgotten. It resurfaced in a 1978 study of lamentation literature by Margaret Green, who noted the passage as an example of inversion rhetoric, a poetic device in which natural order is reversed to emphasize the totality of destruction. Her interpretation became standard. The line was cited in subsequent scholarship as evidence of how Mesopotamian poets used impossible imagery to convey overwhelming catastrophe. But the interpretation required assuming that the scribe understood the impossibility and deployed it deliberately as literary technique. It required assuming that the line was not describing an event, but constructing an effect. What if the scribe was not constructing anything? What if the line preserved a description given by someone who witnessed stone consumed and wood left standing, and who reported exactly that, because that was what occurred? The fragment offers no additional context. It does not explain what kind of fire behaves this way, or under what circumstances the event took place. It simply states the fact and moves on to the next line, which returns to conventional lamentation. The gods abandoned the city, the people wept, the land became silent. The question is not whether the line is possible. The question is what interpretive framework allows modern readers to approach a text that describes the impossible using the grammar of documentation. The methodological problem is older than Assyriology itself. When Henry Rawlinson first deciphered Akkadian in the mid-19th century, working from the trilingual Behistun inscription, he encountered descriptions of Assyrian kings claiming divine sanction for military campaigns. Modern historians dismissed the theological language as propaganda and focused on extracting factual data: dates, place names, lists of conquered cities. The assumption was that ancient texts contained facts embedded in ideology, and that careful reading could separate the two. By the early 20th century, that assumption had become discipline-wide practice. Myth was symbolic, history was factual. Texts that blended the two required parsing. A king who claimed divine support was asserting political legitimacy. A lamentation describing fire from heaven was using theological metaphor to describe military conquest or natural disaster. The framework was not imposed cynically. It was necessary. Without it, the texts were unreadable according to the standards of evidence that defined historical scholarship. But the framework also constrained what could be seen. Descriptions that did not fit expected categories — conquest, flood, earthquake, famine, plague — were either reinterpreted until they did fit, or dismissed as mythological and therefore non-historical. Tablet 9 9602 fell into the second category. Fire that consumed stone but not wood could not describe a real event, therefore it described a literary invention. Therefore, it required no further investigation. The logic was circular but stable. It allowed scholarship to proceed. But it also meant that certain kinds of evidence became invisible, not because they were absent, but because the discipline had no method for processing them. A second fragment, CBS 1201, excavated from Nippur in 1889 and published in partial translation in 1917, contains a similar inversion. The text is a wisdom composition, a genre offering ethical instruction and observations about the nature of existence. Most of the preserved lines are conventional. The righteous suffer, the wicked prosper, human life is brief, the gods are inscrutable. Then, without transition, the text states, "The day became night, but the stars did not appear. The wind rose, but it carried no water. The water was in the canals, but nothing would drink it." Again, the language is descriptive, not metaphorical. Sumerian has a well-developed vocabulary for simile and comparison. This text does not use it. It states conditions as facts. Day became night, wind carried no water, animals would not drink. The tablet was catalogued as a wisdom text, translated and analysed for its theological content. The anomalous passage was noted, but not discussed. It did not fit the genre. Wisdom literature reflects on the human condition. It does not describe environmental phenomena. Therefore, the passage must be figurative, a way of expressing the disorder and unpredictability of existence. But the passage does not read as figurative. It reads as a list of observed conditions, inserted into a composition that otherwise deals in abstraction. Why would a scribe composing a meditation on fate and justice suddenly list specific environmental details, unless those details had some relationship to the questions the text was exploring? And if the details are figurative, what do they figure? What human experience is represented by day becoming night while stars remain invisible, or wind that rises without carrying moisture, or water that animals refuse? The problem extends beyond individual fragments. The lamentation over the destruction of one of the longest and best preserved city laments, exists in multiple manuscript copies dating from the early 2nd millennium. The composition describes the fall of at the end of the III period, an event that occurred around 2004 BCE. The text was composed later, perhaps within a century of the destruction, and copied repeatedly in scribal schools for educational purposes. The lamentation follows a clear structure. Is praised in its glory. The gods decide to abandon it. The goddess Ningal pleads for mercy. The destruction occurs, and the text ends with supplication for restoration. The destruction is attributed to divine will. Enlil decrees it, the Anunnaki execute it, and no human power can prevent it. But within that theological framework, the text includes passages describing physical effects that exceed the usual vocabulary of warfare or natural disaster. One section states, "The storm, appointed to sweep over the land, swept over it. Its fire consumed everything. The city was turned into a ruin mound in a single day. What had stood for 1,000 years did not endure until evening." Another passage describes, "A wind rose up, the water receded, the ground cracked, the air filled with something that burned the throat, the cattle fell in the fields. The people who fled toward the river found the river was gone. Those who remained in the city could not see the person beside them." These descriptions appear amid lines that clearly reference military destruction, enemies entering the city, weapons wielded, people killed. But they also describe environmental collapse occurring simultaneously with or immediately following human agency. The text does not separate the two. It presents them as aspects of a single event, orchestrated by divine decree but manifesting in both human violence and environmental catastrophe. Modern translations often smooth the language, rendering the more extreme descriptions as hyperbole. A terrible storm swept over the land. The city was utterly destroyed. Famine and plague followed. The smoothing is not dishonest. It reflects the translator's judgment that the original language must be interpreted, not rendered literally. but it also removes the strangeness. When the text says, "The river was gone," translators write, "The water supply failed." When the text says, "The air filled with something that burned," translators write, "There was great suffering." The adjustments make the text more readable, more recognizable, more consistent with what destruction is expected to look like. But they also normalize what the text insists was not normal. Tablet UM 2913567, held at the University Museum in Philadelphia, preserves a section of an omen compendium dealing with atmospheric phenomena. The tablet is Old Babylonian in date, but preserves earlier material, as indicated by the archaic orthography of certain signs. The preserved section catalogues omens derived from observing the sky at dawn. Most entries follow predictable patterns. Red sky indicates wind, thick clouds indicate rain. The position of Venus relative to the moon indicates favourable or unfavourable conditions for ritual activity. Then, between two standard entries, an observation appears without an attached prediction. If at dawn the sky is white in all directions, and the sun rises but gives no warmth, and birds fall from the air, this has been seen twice. The phrase, "this has been seen twice," is unusual. Omen compendia typically do not comment on the frequency of observed phenomena. They catalogue conditions and attach predictions, treating each omen as a repeatable type. But this entry breaks the pattern. It describes a specific set of conditions: white sky, cold sunlight, birds falling, and then notes that it has occurred twice. The entry provides no prediction, no ritual response, no interpretation. It simply records that the phenomenon happened, was observed, and happened again. The tablet was published in 1976 in a volume cataloguing omens related to celestial and meteorological events. The editor noted the anomalous entry in a footnote, but offered no comment beyond transcription and translation. The phrase, "this has been seen twice," suggested to him that the entry was incomplete, that a prediction had been lost in a break in the tablet. But the tablet is not broken at that point. The entry is complete as preserved. The scribe recorded an observation, noted its recurrence, and moved on to the next omen. What kind of atmospheric event produces white sky, cold sunlight, and falling birds? And why does its recurrence matter enough to note, but not enough to generate a prediction? The structure of omen literature is built on the assumption that observed phenomena correlate with future outcomes. The observation is valuable because it allows prediction. But this entry does not predict, it only counts. It marks the fact that something happened more than once, as if recurrence itself was the significant detail. The question is whether the entry reflects an attempt to document a phenomenon that did not yet have an interpretive framework, something observed but not yet understood, or whether it reflects memory of events sufficiently rare that their recurrence was itself noteworthy. The text does not clarify. It only preserves the fact that Mesopotamian scholars at some point witnessed conditions in the sky that required documentation but resisted interpretation, and they witnessed those conditions at least twice. Tablet K2824, excavated by Hormuzd Rassam from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in 1853 and now housed in the British Museum, preserves a section of a late recension of the Atra-Hassis epic, a composition describing the creation of humanity and its near destruction by flood. The text is well known, translated and studied extensively, but within the standard narrative, a single line has generated persistent debate among Assyriologists. The line appears in the section describing the gods' decision to destroy humanity. Enlil, frustrated by human noise, proposes various methods: plague, famine, drought. Each fails to reduce the population sufficiently. Finally, Enlil orders the flood. The line in question appears between the drought and the flood, in a passage that describes conditions immediately preceding divine decision to unleash water. The Akkadian reads, "Ishtum ina ilim, me ishkunu shame ina kablitim iziku." A literal translation: when the gods placed fire in the sky, the heavens flared in the middle. The verb iziku, from zaku, means to blow, to flare, to rise up suddenly. It is used elsewhere in Akkadian to describe wind rising or flames leaping. Here it describes the sky itself. Most translations render the passage as metaphor. When the gods placed the fire in the sky, the heavens blazed with divine fury. The adjustment treats the line as theological language, a way of describing divine anger made visible. But the grammar does not support metaphorical reading. The line is syntactically parallel to other lines in the passage that describe physical actions. The gods withheld rain, the gods stopped the springs, the gods placed fire in the sky, the heavens flared. The sequence is presented as a series of concrete acts with observable consequences. If the first two lines are meant literally, rain was withheld, springs stopped, why is the third suddenly figurative? A clue appears in a Sumerian lexical text known as the Idu series, a compilation of Sumerian terms with Akkadian equivalents used in scribal education. The series dates to the Old Babylonian period, but was copied and expanded for more than a millennium. One section catalogues terms related to fire and burning. The Sumerian term gibil is listed with multiple Akkadian equivalents depending on context. Ishatu for ordinary fire, sheru for wildfire, shurpu for fire used in purification rituals. But one entry gives gibil with the Akkadian equivalent mikit shame, the fire of the sky. The term appears nowhere else in the lexical lists. It is not defined or explained. It is simply listed as a category of fire that exists and requires vocabulary. The phrase mikit shame is otherwise attested only in omen literature, where it appears in contexts describing meteors, lightning, and eclipses, celestial phenomena involving light or fire. But the lexical list treats it as a type of gibil, ordinary fire, not as astronomical phenomenon. This suggests that Mesopotamian scribes categorized certain fires not by their source, wood, oil, lightning, but by their effects or appearance, and that one such category was fire of the sky, understood as distinct from but related to fire on earth. Another text complicates the picture. Tablet BM 86381, part of the Sipar library collection acquired by the British Museum in the late 19th century, contains a bilingual incantation, Sumerian text with interlinear Akkadian translation, used in rituals to protect against fire. The incantation is structured as a series of commands directed at fire itself, ordering it to retreat, to spare the house, to consume only what is offered. Most of the commands are standard. Fire, do not approach the door. Fire, do not touch the roof. Fire, eat the offering and depart. But one line diverges. Fire that falls from above, fire that rises from below, fire that moves in the wind without smoke. These three shall not enter. The line distinguishes three types of fire by behavior, not origin. Fire that falls from above might be embers from a neighboring building or lightning. Fire that rises from below might be sparks from a hearth. But fire that moves in the wind without smoke does not fit any ordinary combustion process. All fire produces smoke unless it burns at extreme temperatures or consumes materials that gasify completely before producing particulate residue. The incantation treats this third type as equivalent in danger to the other two, something that required ritual protection, something that occurred with sufficient frequency that scribes included it in standard apotropaic formulas. The Sumerian term in that line is gibil anta, literally fire from above, paired with gibil kita, fire from below, and gibil imnudu, which translates awkwardly as fire of wind not making smoke. The verb do, to make or to build, is used throughout Sumerian to describe processes of construction and production. Fire that does not make smoke is fire that fails to produce an expected byproduct. The phrase is precise, technical, descriptive. It identifies a phenomenon observable enough to require naming and frequent enough to require ritual countermeasures. Yet no Sumerian or Akkadian text describes what this fire actually is, where it comes from, or under what circumstances it occurs. The texts simply assume that anyone reciting the incantation knows what Gibil im Nudu refers to, because they have seen it or heard it described. The challenge for modern interpretation is that we have not seen it. We have no referent for fire that moves without smoke, that falls from the sky and rises from the earth, that behaves in ways requiring separate ritual address. So translations smooth the language. Fire from all directions, devastating fire, uncontrollable fire. The specificity collapses into generality, and the text becomes a conventional prayer against a conventional danger. But the original text is not conventional. It names 3 distinct types of fire and treats the third as anomalous enough to require separate identification. A 4th text adds archaeological context. During excavations at Tel ed-Dur, ancient Sippar, in 1972, Belgian archaeologists uncovered a room in the temple complex containing approximately 60 tablets stacked in a corner. The tablets were administrative records dating to the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, an old Babylonian king ruling around 1646–1626 BCE. Most recorded routine transactions, silver loans, barley rations, dates distributed to workers. One tablet, catalogued as DER 371, recorded a distribution of oil and incense to temple personnel over a period of 3 months. The entries were standard until the final column, where the scribe added a notation not formatted as part of the distribution record. 14, Ina Arahim Shabbatim. Shama Imuru Ina Mushim, Kima Umim. On day 14 in the month of Shabbatu, the sky appeared at night as in daytime. No further detail. The next line returned to the distribution list. The tablet was fired, sealed, and stored with other administrative documents. The notation was not a literary flourish or a scribal exercise. It was a marginal observation added to an accounting record, something the scribe considered significant enough to document, but not significant enough to warrant a separate tablet. The phenomenon described, night sky appearing as daylight, has clear possible explanations: auroras, bright meteors, large fires. But the phrasing is specific. The sky appeared, not the ground was illuminated. The light source was above, not below. And the comparison is not to fire or to moonlight, but to daytime, suggesting diffuse illumination rather than a point source. The notation is one of dozens scattered through Old Babylonian administrative archives. Another, from Lhasa, notes that the air became dark at midday and lamps were lit in the houses. Another, from Ur, states that a wind came from the west, carrying dust that covered the tablets in the archive room, and the dust could not be swept away because it stuck to the clay. These observations are not literary. They are not part of any composition or genre. They are simply things scribes noticed and, for reasons they did not explain, felt compelled to record in spaces normally left blank on administrative tablets. The pattern suggests that scribes understood their role as documentarians not only of transactions, but of anomalies, events that disrupted normal practice and therefore required notation alongside the records of normal practice. What kinds of atmospheric events occurred frequently enough that scribes considered them worth documenting, but not frequently enough that those documents became routine? And why do the descriptions cluster around phenomena involving light, darkness, and air? Conditions that should be regular and predictable, but are described as irregular and disruptive. The lexical evidence provides one more thread. A group of tablets known collectively as the Erim Hus series, a Sumerian Akkadian thematic lexical list, catalogues terms related to buildings, materials, and construction. One section deals with words describing damage and destruction to structures. The list includes expected terms: abalu, to dry up, describing mud brick decay; makatu, to fall, describing collapse; sharapu, to burn, describing fire damage. Then appears a term without Sumerian equivalent, na'amrutu, from the Akkadian verb namaru, to be bright. The term is glossed as destruction by light, or damage from brightness. The entry provides no context, no explanation. It simply lists Namrutu as a category of destruction alongside more familiar types. The term appears in one other context, a late Assyrian omen text describing the interpretation of cracks in the liver of a sacrificed sheep. One entry states, "If the liver shows cracks in the finger and the cracks are white rather than red, this indicates Namrutu will strike the city." The prediction is framed as disaster, equivalent to plague or siege, but the mechanism is not described. The cracks are white, an unusual detail in liver divination, where colour typically distinguishes blood, bile, or disease. The whiteness of the cracks correlates with Namrutu, destruction by brightness. The logic of the correlation is not given. The text assumes the diviner will understand what Namrutu means and what white cracks predict. What category of destruction is caused by brightness or light? Fire damages by heat, producing charred remains. Flood damages by force and saturation. Earthquake damages by shaking. What damages by light itself? The term exists, is categorized alongside other forms of destruction, and appears in predictive contexts, but it is never described. The texts assume knowledge that they do not transmit, knowledge of a phenomenon observable enough to require vocabulary, but rare enough that the vocabulary appears only in specialized contexts. Lexical lists used in scribal training, omens consulted by ritual specialists, marginal notes added by bureaucrats recording the unusual. The modern reader is left with a term, Namrutu, a category, destruction by brightness, and no description of what the category contains. We know that Mesopotamian scribes recognized it as real, predictable, and dangerous, but we do not know what it was. The question is whether that absence reflects a gap in the surviving evidence, or whether it reflects something the scribes themselves could not fully explain, and therefore could only name, categorize, and attempt to predict or prevent through ritual means. In 1967, the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago published a volume cataloguing tablets excavated from Eshnunna, modern Tel Asmar, during expeditions conducted between 1930 and 1936. Among the administrative texts was a tablet designated as 32542, a list of cities and their tribute obligations to the regional governor. The tablet dated to the early 2nd millennium, during the period when Eshnunna functioned as an independent kingdom before its absorption by Babylon under Hammurabi. The list was routine, 23 cities, each followed by quantities of barley, silver, or livestock owed annually. The scribe had organized the entries geographically, moving from north to south, listing cities in the order a courier would visit them. 19 of the cities appeared in other administrative records from the same archive: tax receipts, grain shipments, labor conscription orders. 4 cities appeared only on this list. Their names were written clearly: Bad Tibera, Larak, Sipar Amnonum, and Kutha. Each was assigned a tribute amount, each formatted identically to the other entries. But no tablets in the Eshnunna archive recorded tribute actually received from these 4. No correspondence mentioned them. No ration lists included their residents. The cities existed on the obligation list as if they were functional members of the administrative network, but they generated no documentation proving they were. The absence might indicate nothing more than incomplete records, tablets lost, texts not yet excavated, archives damaged. But 2 of the 4 cities, Bad Tibera and Larak, appeared in other contexts that complicated that explanation. The Sumerian king list, a historiographic composition listing rulers before and after the flood, named both cities as seats of antediluvian kingship. Bad Tibera was listed as the second city to receive kingship after Eridu, ruled by 3 kings over a span of 108,000 years. Larak was the 4th city, ruled by 1 king for 28,800 years. The chronology was mythological, the numbers symbolic, but the cities themselves were treated as historical entities, places where kingship had once resided. After the flood, Neither city appeared in the king list again. Kingship moved to Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, cycling through cities that existed and functioned in historical periods. Bad Tibera and Larak were not mentioned again in administrative or royal inscriptions. Yet the tribute list from Eshnunna, composed more than 1,000 years after the king list's earliest versions, still included them as if they were operational cities capable of producing barley and silver. Were the entries vestigial, copied from earlier lists by scribes who did not verify whether the cities still existed, or did the cities exist in some reduced form, occupied but no longer administratively integrated, present enough to be listed but not functional enough to generate records? Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1960s and 1980s identified possible locations for both Bad Tibera and Larak based on toponymic evidence and the distribution of early Sumerian sites. Bad Tibera was tentatively identified with Tel al-Medina, a site showing occupation during the early dynastic and early Akkadian periods. Larak was associated with Tel al-Wilaya, the site later occupied by Mashkan Shapir. Surface surveys and limited excavation revealed that both sites experienced sudden abandonment at the end of the early dynastic III period, around 2350 BCE, followed by sparse reoccupation during later periods. The occupation gap coincided with the transition from early dynastic city-states to the Akkadian Empire, a period of political upheaval, but not one typically associated with urban abandonment. Cities conquered by the Akkadian kings remained occupied, their populations conscripted into the new administrative framework. But Bad Tibera and Larak appeared to have been abandoned, not conquered. The archaeological signatures showed no destruction layers, no burned gates, no weapon caches or mass graves. The cities simply stopped functioning as urban centres. Later occupation was limited to small settlements that did not rebuild the monumental architecture, did not restore the irrigation networks, and did not generate the administrative archives that characterized Mesopotamian cities. What remained were ruins, structures too damaged or too symbolically compromised to warrant restoration, even when the regions around them were repopulated. A tablet from the Louvre, AO 5376, catalogued as part of the Tello collection excavated by Ernest de Sarzec in the 1890s, adds a textual dimension. The tablet is a hymn to the goddess Ninhursagr, composed during the Ur-III period. The hymn praises the goddess for her role in creation, her protection of kings, and her presence in sacred cities. The list of cities includes the expected centres: Eridu, Ur, Nippur, Uruk. Then, without transition, the hymn names Bad Tibera and Larak, stating, "Your house in Bad Tibera is silent. Your house in Larak no longer hears offerings. The doors are closed, but no one closed them. The fires are out, but no one extinguished them." The phrasing mirrors the structure of lamentation literature: descriptions of temples abandoned, rituals ceased, divine presence withdrawn. But this hymn is not a lamentation. It is a praise composition, celebrating the goddess in cities where she is actively worshipped. The reference to Bad Tibera and Larak disrupts the celebratory tone. The text acknowledges their temples as belonging to the goddess, but describes them as already beyond restoration. The doors are closed, but no agent is named. The fires are out, but no event is blamed. The condition is presented as permanent, something that does not require explanation, because explanation would change nothing. Why does a praise hymn include ruins? The function of such compositions is to affirm divine presence, to list the cities where the goddess resides and receives worship. Including cities where worship has ceased seems counterproductive unless the inclusion serves a different purpose. To acknowledge that the goddess once resided there, that those cities were once as vital as Ur or Nippur, and that their silence is itself a theological statement. The goddess did not fail. The cities failed. The contrast reinforces the goddess's power by showing that her presence, once withdrawn, cannot be replaced by human effort. The ruins remain as evidence not of divine weakness, but of divine judgment, or at least divine departure. The hymn does not explain why the goddess left. It only marks the fact that she did, and that the cities have not recovered. The question is whether that departure was metaphor for political collapse, for environmental failure, or for something else. Some event that made the cities uninhabitable in ways that conquest or economic decline do not. A cadastral survey from Umma, tablet ITT2, 3831, held at the Archaeological Museum Istanbul, provides economic context. The tablet dates to the Ur-3 period, contemporary with the hymn to Ninhur Saga. It is a land survey recording field boundaries, irrigation access, and production assessments for agricultural land under the administration of the Umma province. The survey lists fields by name, area, and expected yield in barley. One section of the survey describes fields designated as the fields of the silent cities. The term is Shukud Uru Nudabba, literally fields of cities not seized, or fields of cities not captured. The phrasing is ambiguous. It could mean cities that were never conquered, or cities that no longer exist to be conquered. The fields themselves were productive. The survey assessed their yield and assigned them to the Umma administration for cultivation. But they were identified by their association with cities that were no longer administratively present. The silent cities were not named in the survey. The scribe assumed the designation was sufficient, that anyone reading the tablet would know which cities were meant. The fields had reverted to state control, not because they were confiscated, but because the cities that had once claimed them were no longer functional entities capable of asserting ownership. The pattern appears in other cadastral documents from the late Ur-3 period. Fields associated with Bad Tibera, Larak, Sipa Amnanum, and Kutha were reassigned to nearby provincial centres, Umma, Lagash, Girsu. The reassignments were recorded without commentary as routine administrative actions. But the frequency of reassignment increased sharply during the final decades of Ur-3, coinciding with the broader systemic collapse documented in ration distributions and livestock accounts. Cities that had been marginal but functional became non-functional without evidence of conquest or deliberate destruction. The fields remained cultivable. The irrigation networks, where they survived, could be maintained. But the urban centres themselves were abandoned, their populations dispersed, their administrative archives closed. The question is, what causes cities to empty while their hinterlands remain viable? Military conquest occupies cities, replaces leadership, extracts tribute, but does not typically depopulate urban centres entirely. Economic decline leads to gradual shrinkage, the reduction of public building projects, the departure of elites, but leaves a residual population. Plague depopulates catastrophically, but leaves ruins that can be reoccupied once the disease passes. What the archaeological and textual evidence describes is different. Cities that stopped functioning suddenly were not reoccupied in subsequent generations, but were not destroyed in ways that left clear physical signatures. The silence was administrative, demographic, and ritual. The cities were not conquered, they were not burned. They were emptied and left empty, and later populations did not return to them, even when the surrounding regions were resettled. Tablet HS 1884, part of the Hilprecht collection at the Friedrich Schiller Universität Jena, provides a final piece. The tablet is a letter from a regional official to the governor of Girsu, dated to the reign of Ibi-Sin, the last king of the Ur-3 dynasty. The letter is brief, following the standard epistolary format: greeting, statement of business, closing formula. The business is a request for instructions regarding fields near Bad Tibera. The official writes, "The fields that belonged to Bad Tibera are now contested by shepherds from Umma. I went to Bad Tibera to inquire who holds authority there. The gates were open, the streets were empty. I found no one to answer. I am writing to ask, who now holds these fields?" The letter is remarkable for what it describes without dramatizing. The official approached the city expecting to find someone, a governor, a council of elders, a temple administrator, who could clarify land rights. He found empty streets and open gates. The city was not locked or defended, it was simply unoccupied. The official did not describe ruins. He did not mention damage. He did not speculate on what had happened. He simply reported the absence of people and requested administrative clarification. The letter implies that Bad Tabira's abandonment was recent enough that its fields were still identified as belonging to the city, but complete enough that no one remained to assert that claim. The governor's response, if it existed, has not been preserved. But the question the letter raises remains: what causes a city to empty so completely that an official visiting months or years later finds gates open and no one present to explain where the population went? Tablet NBC 8028, housed in the Yale Babylonian collection, is a ration distribution list from Puzrish Dagan, dated to the 10th month of Ibisin's 19th year. The tablet measures 12 centimeters by 9, preserves 43 lines, and follows the standard format developed by III bureaucrats to track the allocation of food to temple personnel, craftsmen, and royal dependents. Each line lists a recipient's name, their occupation or affiliation, and the quantity of barley or oil assigned. The scribe who wrote the tablet was named Lu Ninshubur, a frequently attested figure in the Puzrish Dagan archives, whose hand can be identified across hundreds of tablets spanning 2 decades. Lu Ninshubur's writing was precise, his orthography conservative, his administrative protocols meticulous. The tablet proceeded normally through line 37. Names, titles, amounts, all formatted according to template. Line 38 began with a name, el-Lama, a livestock supervisor, followed by the notation of expected rations, 5 selah of barley. Then, instead of completing the entry, the scribe added in smaller wedges pressed into the remaining space, Nu mu un dab 5, not received. The phrase was not part of the standard vocabulary of distribution lists. Lu Ninshubur had never used it before in any of his prior tablets. The next line listed another name, another allocation, another notation. Nu mu un dab 5. The pattern continued through the final 6 entries. The tablet was sealed with the official seal of Puzrish Dagan's chief administrator, meaning the document was reviewed and certified as complete. It was then filed in the archive room alongside hundreds of other distribution lists from the same year. The notation, not received, transformed the tablet from a record of distribution into a record of distribution failure. But the failure was not corrected. The tablet was not marked as provisional or incomplete. It was processed as if documenting non-distribution was equivalent to documenting distribution, as if the system's function was not to ensure delivery, but to maintain records, regardless of whether those records documented success or collapse. The phrase Nu mu un dab 5 appeared sporadically in earlier Puzrish Dagan archives, usually in marginal notes or corrections. A ration list might record an allocation, then add in a different hand. Not received, to be redistributed next month. The notation indicated a temporary disruption, a courier delayed, a recipient absent, a shortage requiring adjustment. But starting in Ibisin's 17th year, the phrase began appearing not as correction, but as primary documentation. Entire columns of tablets were filled with names, allocations, and the repeated statement, not received. The bureaucracy had shifted from documenting what occurred to documenting what should have occurred, but did not. The distinction is subtle, but fundamental. A system documenting actual distributions can be audited, verified, and corrected. A system documenting theoretical distributions, regardless of actual delivery, cannot be audited at all, because the discrepancy between document and reality is no longer treated as error. It is treated as data. By Ibisin's 23rd year, more than 40% of the ration tablets from Puzrish Dagan included the notation Nu mu un DAB 5, or equivalent phrases. Outstanding, deferred, shepherd did not come, road closed, allocation pending. The percentages are calculable because the archives are sufficiently complete that statistical analysis is possible. Wolfgang Heimpel's 2009 study of the Pusrish Dagan corpus compiled data from 4,847 published tablets and found that the frequency of non-delivery notations increased exponentially during the final 8 years of Ibbi Sin's reign. In year 17, 6% of entries included non-delivery notations. In year 20, 18%. In year 24, the final year for which tablets are preserved, 43%. The system did not collapse suddenly. It degraded incrementally, and the degradation was documented with the same bureaucratic precision that had documented functionality. Scribes continued writing tablets. Seals continued certifying them. Archives continued filing them. But the content of the documents shifted from records of economic activity to records of economic failure, presented as if they were still records of economic activity. A second pattern emerged in the same period, the replacement of specific allocations with placeholder entries. Tablet AUC-T3 448 from Pusrish Dagan, dated to Ibbi Sin's 21st year, lists 32 recipients of barley rations. 26 entries provide names and amounts. 6 entries provide only the phrase En Nam Dub Phi Ba, whoever receives it. The phrase appears where a name should be. The amount is listed, 5 sealer, 10 sealer, but the recipient is unspecified. The implication is that the ration would be distributed to whoever was present to receive it, rather than to a designated individual whose presence could be verified. The shift indicates a breakdown in the tracking system. Earlier tablets documented not only what was distributed, but who received it, allowing audits that could detect fraud, double payment, or misallocation. A tablet listing whoever receives it cannot be audited. It documents only that resources left the storehouse, not where they went, or whether they reached their intended purpose. The phrase appeared rarely before Ibbi Sin's reign. During his reign, it became standard. By year 22, more than a third of ration tablets from Pusrish Dagan included at least one whoever receives it entry. The bureaucracy was maintaining the form of distribution while abandoning the substance, the individual accountability that had made the system functional. Tablet MVN 13, 831, from the same archive, provides an even more precise marker of systemic failure. The tablet is dated to the 3rd month of Ibbi Sin's 23rd year and records the allocation of sheep for sacrifices at temples in Nippur, Ur, and Uruk. The allocations are listed by temple, by ritual occasion, and by delivery date. Then, at the bottom of the tablet, the scribe added a summary line. Total: 840 sheep assigned. Delivered: 0. Remaining in pen: 127. Deficit: 713. The summary is extraordinary. The scribe documented that none of the assigned animals had been delivered, that the livestock centre still held 127 sheep, and that 713 sheep expected to be in the system were missing. The deficit was not explained. No notation indicated theft, death, or reassignment. The sheep were simply absent from the count, and the absence was totalled as if it were a normal administrative variable. The tablet was sealed and filed. No follow-up document addressed the deficit. No investigation was recorded. The system acknowledged the loss and continued operating as if loss at this scale were sustainable. The question is not whether the Ur-3 state was collapsing, it clearly was. The question is why the bureaucratic apparatus continued generating documents that meticulously recorded collapse without implementing responses. A functional administration encountering 40% non-delivery rates would halt distributions, investigate causes, and restructure the system. The Pusrish Dagan archives show no evidence of restructuring. They show only increasing documentation of failure, formatted identically to documentation of success. The scribes were not unaware of the crisis. The language they used, not received, road closed, shepherd did not come, acknowledged that the system was not functioning. But the acknowledgement was embedded in documents that assumed the system's continuation. The tablets record distributions that did not happen, as if they had happened, assign resources to unspecified recipients, and tally deficits without proposing remedies. The administrative logic had become circular. The system existed to document itself, and as long as documentation continued, the system was treated as operational, even when the operations it documented were not occurring. A final tablet, Naten 549, dated to Ibisin's 24th year, marks the endpoint. The tablet is a ration list, formatted identically to thousands of earlier examples. It lists 15 recipients, all temple personnel. Each line begins with a name and title. Then, instead of listing an amount of barley or oil, each entry states mu-du, brought in, followed by a blank space. The verb mu-du, from the Sumerian tum, means to bring, to carry in, to deliver. But the construction here is passive and incomplete. Was brought in, with no object specified. What was brought in? By whom? In what amount? The tablet does not say. It simply lists names and the assertion that something was brought in for each person. The verso of the tablet, where the total and the scribe's seal would normally appear, is blank except for the date formula. The tablet was never finished, but it was fired, which means it was treated as complete enough to preserve. The document records the form of a ration distribution, names, structure, date, but omits all substantive content. It is a ghost tablet, the bureaucratic shadow of a distribution that may or may not have occurred, documented by a scribe who no longer had the information, the resources, or perhaps the expectation that the information mattered. No tablets from Pusrish Dargan are dated to Ibisin's 25th year. The archive ends not with a statement of closure, but with an absence. The scribes stopped writing, the seals stopped certifying, and the system that had generated more than 15,000 documents over 60 years fell silent. The silence was not dramatic, it was administrative. One month there were tablets documenting failure, the next month there were no tablets at all. The question is what happens to the scribes, the administrators, the shepherds, the temple personnel, all the individuals named in the archives, when the system that organized their labor, tracked their rations, and recorded their existence stops functioning. Where do they go when the tablets no longer list them? And why does the last phase of the system devote so much effort to documenting its own inability to perform its function, as if documentation itself were the function, even when what it documented was absence? In 1906, during the fourth season of the University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur, a large pottery jar was uncovered beneath the floor of a private house in the scribal quarter. The jar contained 16 clay prisms, each approximately 20 centimeters tall, covered with columns of cuneiform text arranged in the prism's 4 faces. The texts were copies of the Sumerian king list, a historiographic composition cataloguing rulers from the descent of kingship from heaven to the reign of Sin-Magir of Isin, around 1827 BCE. The prisms, catalogued collectively as Weld Blundell collection items and now housed partly at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, were Old Babylonian in date, copied during the early 2nd millennium from older sources. One prism, designated WB 444, preserves the most complete version. The text begins, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." It lists Eridu's rulers, gives their reign lengths, then states, "Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibera." The formula repeats. Rulers listed, reign lengths given, city falls, kingship moves. The structure presents political change as orderly succession. each city's dynasty ending and transferring authority to the next without overlap or contest. The list proceeds through 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, before stating, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood, the list resumes. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. The post-Diluvian section continues through dynasties of Kish, Uruk, Ur, and other cities, some historically attested, others of uncertain existence. The reign lengths become shorter, centuries rather than millennia, but the structure remains unchanged. Each dynasty ends, kingship moves, continuity is maintained. The king list is not a chronicle. It does not describe how kingship transferred. It does not explain why cities fell. It states only that they did and that kingship survived the transitions. The composition's purpose is ideological, to establish that kingship is eternal, divinely ordained, and uninterrupted by political catastrophe. But embedded in that ideology is a documentary claim. The cities named in the list, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, Umma, were real cities. Many of the kings named can be correlated with rulers attested in administrative and royal inscriptions. The list combines historiographic fiction, impossible reign lengths, schematic successions, with historiographic data, real places, real rulers, actual sequences of power. The combination makes the text both unreliable as history and invaluable as evidence of how Mesopotamian scribes understood the relationship between kingship and catastrophe. Kingship survives because it is more fundamental than cities. Cities fall, but the institution of kingship moves to a new location and continues without interruption. The formula used to describe transitions is revealing. In Sumerian, the text states, Bahul, it was destroyed, followed by Namlugal Batum, kingship was carried. The verb hul means to destroy, to ruin, to overthrow. It is the same term used in lamentation literature to describe cities devastated by divine judgment or military conquest. The verb tum means to carry, to bring, to transport. The same verb used in administrative texts to describe moving goods from one location to another. Kingship is treated as a physical object, portable and transferable. When a city is destroyed, kingship is not destroyed with it. It is carried elsewhere. The passive construction, kingship was carried, leaves the agent unstated. Who carries kingship? The gods, presumably, since kingship descends from heaven. But the text does not specify. It simply asserts that the transfer occurs, that kingship's continuity is not dependent on any individual city's survival. The question is whether this reflects political theology, an ideological claim about the nature of authority, or historical memory, an observation that ruling institutions persisted across events that destroyed their urban centres. A second text complicates the interpretation. Tablet AO 8862, part of the Louvre's early acquisitions from southern Mesopotamia, is a royal inscription of Utu Hegal, king of Uruk, ruling around 2055 BCE. The inscription commemorates Utu Hegal's victory over the Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains who had dominated southern Mesopotamia for more than a century following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. The text describes the Gutians as the fanged serpent of the mountains, who carried off the kingship of Sumer. The phrase is precise. Kingship was not destroyed, it was carried off, taken from Sumer by foreign invaders. Then Utu Hegal describes his campaign. Enlil gave me strength. I pursued the Gutians. I defeated their king. I returned the kingship to Sumer. The inscription does not claim that Utu Hegal invented kingship or established a new form of rule. It claims that he restored something that had been taken, returning it to its proper location. The ideology is identical to that of the king list. Kingship is portable, transferable, and independent of individual rulers. It can be taken, lost, and recovered, but it cannot be destroyed. The inscription was copied and recopied during the Ur-3 period, treated as a foundational text legitimizing the Ur-3 dynasty, which claimed descent from Utu-Hegal. But the copies added a detail absent in the original. Later versions of the inscription included a line stating, "The cities had been silent, but after kingship returned, the cities spoke again." The verb used is the Sumerian dug for gar, to speak, often translated metaphorically as to be inhabited or to function. Cities that speak are cities where administrative activity occurs, where temples conduct rituals, where markets operate. Cities that are silent are cities where these activities have ceased. The later scribes who copied Utu-Hegal's inscription understood kingship's return not merely as political restoration, but as the prerequisite for urban functionality. Without kingship, cities fell silent. With kingship restored, cities resumed operation. The implication is that kingship was not simply political authority, but the organizing principle that allowed urban civilization to exist. Its absence did not mean anarchy or foreign rule. It meant the cessation of the activities that defined urban life. The question is whether that cessation was administrative, a failure of the bureaucratic systems that tracked labor and resources, or physical, a collapse of the populations and infrastructure that those systems administered. A third text narrows the question. Tablet CBS 19797 from the University of Pennsylvania Museum is a votive inscription of Ishbi-Erra, the founder of the Isin dynasty, ruling around 2017 to 1985 BCE. Ishbi-Erra rose to power during the final collapse of the Ur-3 state, initially serving as a governor under Ibbi-Sin before establishing independent rule in Isin. His inscriptions claim legitimacy by asserting continuity with Ur. One inscription states, "When the gods turned their faces away from Ur, when they scattered its people, I gathered the scattered ones. I rebuilt what had been destroyed. I restored the kingship that had been interrupted." The phrasing acknowledges a break. Kingship was interrupted, not merely transferred. The continuity claimed by the king list's formula, "kingship moves smoothly from city to city," is here described as restoration after rupture. Ishbi-Erra does not claim that kingship moved naturally from Ur to Isin. He claims that he re-established it, implying a period when kingship did not exist anywhere, when the institution itself had lapsed. The inscription continues, "The roads were cut, the water was bitter, the fields were white with salt. I made the roads passable, I made the water sweet, I made the fields green again." The tasks described are not military victories or legal reforms, they are environmental restorations. Ishbi-Erra claims to have reversed ecological collapse, to have repaired not just political structures, but the physical landscape itself. The inscription was found in a temple foundation deposit, buried beneath the floor during construction. It was not meant to be read by human audiences. It was addressed to the gods, justifying Ishbi-Erra's rule by listing the conditions he inherited and the restorations he accomplished. The environmental details, bitter water, salted fields, impassable roads, match the conditions documented in the final Ur-3 administrative texts and in the lamentation literature composed after Ur's fall. But Ishbi-Erra's inscription frames those conditions not as localized disasters, but as symptoms of kingship's absence. Without kingship, the land itself fails. With kingship restored, the land recovers. The theology is consistent with earlier traditions, but the specificity of the environmental claims suggests that the theology was not purely abstract. It was grounded in observable conditions, fields that had become infertile, water sources that had become unusable, infrastructure that had ceased functioning, and it claimed that those conditions were reversible, not through technical intervention, but through political legitimacy, divinely sanctioned. A fourth text provides chronological precision. Tablet YBC 4499 in the Yale Babylonian collection is a date formula list, a type of document that records the names of years by the significant events that occurred during them. Mesopotamian kings did not number years sequentially. Each year was named for an event. Year that the Temple of Inanna was built. Year after the king defeated Elam. The date formula list from YBC 4499 covers the reigns of the last three Ur-3 kings, Shusin, Ibisin, and the first three Isin kings, Ishbi-Era, Shu-Ilishu, Idin-Dagan. The transition from Ur-3 to Isin is marked by a break in the list. The final year name for Ibisin is Year when the gods turned their faces from Sumer. The next entry is Year when Ishbi-Era became king in Isin. Between the two entries, the scribe left a space, 3 horizontal lines, blank except for a single notation, Mu-Nu-Tuku, years without names. The phrase indicates a period when no royal authority existed to name the years, when the system of chronological record-keeping had lapsed. The duration of the unnamed years is not specified. It could be 1 year or 10. But the notation confirms that scribes understood the transition from Ur-3 to Isin not as seamless succession, but as rupture, a period when the mechanisms of kingship, including the authority to name time, had ceased to function. When Ishbi-Era claimed to have restored interrupted kingship, he was not using hyperbole. He was describing a documentable gap in the chronological record, a span when the administrative and ideological structures of Mesopotamian kingship did not operate. The question is, what fills that gap? The Lamentations describe divine abandonment, military defeat, environmental collapse. The administrative texts document system failure, resource shortages, population displacement. The royal inscriptions claim restoration of order after chaos. But none of the texts describe the actual conditions during the gap, how people organized themselves without kingship, whether cities remained inhabited, what forms of authority, if any, functioned during the period when kingship was absent. The gap is marked chronologically, acknowledged textually, and bounded by before and after. But it remains empty. The kings who ruled before the break described a functioning system. The kings who ruled after claim to have restored it. But the break itself, the years without names, the period when kingship was interrupted, is documented only by its absence. What kind of event creates a gap in the chronological record of a civilization whose entire administrative apparatus was built on the continuous documentation of time, labor, and transaction? And how does kingship return after such a gap, not through conquest or revolution, but through the restoration of the infrastructure, environmental and administrative, that had allowed kingship to function in the first place? Tablet K 3454, excavated by Hormuzd Rassam from the Southwest Palace at Nineveh in 1853 and now held in the British Museum, preserves a fragment of the Era epic, a composition dated to the late 2nd or early 1st millennium BCE. The text describes the god Era, divine embodiment of plague, destruction, and disorder, usurping the throne of Babylon while Marduk is absent. The preserved section describes Era's unleashing of the Seven, a group of warrior gods who serve as his agents. The Akkadian reads, "The seven, unrivaled warriors arose. Era opened his mouth and spoke to the seven. When I rise up and plunge into battle, let the gods flee. Let the very ground shake beneath me. Let the stars fall from their stations. Let me loose the deluge weapon, the fire that burns without wood." The term translated as deluge weapon is kaku abubu, literally weapon of flood or weapon that overwhelms. But the context pairs it with fire that burns without wood, ishtum shah la ishi, a phrase that does not describe metaphorical fire. The grammar is literal, fire which does not have wood. The pairing suggests that the kaku abubu is not flood, but something comparable to flood in scale, paired with a type of fire that operates without fuel. The seven are described in the next lines. They are born in the mountains. They are nourished on the breast of Tiamat. They are clothed in terror. Their appearance burns like lightning. Their weapons are the storm and the blazing fire. The descriptors are formulaic, drawn from the conventional vocabulary used to describe divine warriors throughout Mesopotamian literature. But the weapons assigned to them, storm and blazing fire, are not conventional. Most divine weapons in Mesopotamian texts are objects: bows, spears, maces, nets. These weapons are forces, storms and fire, entities that act rather than tools that are wielded. The distinction is preserved grammatically. A bow is held, aimed, and released. A storm arises, strikes, and dissipates. The 7 wield weapons that function more like natural disasters than military equipment, yet the text categorizes them as weapons, tools deployed intentionally for specific purposes. The composition continues with a description of the effects. Error smashed the cities, error leveled the mountains, error dried up the sea, error made the rivers recede, the livestock fell in the fields, the people hid in their houses, but the weapon entered through the doors. The weapon entered through the windows, it entered through cracks in the walls. No one could escape it, no door could stop it, no fortification could defend against it. The description follows the logic of a military campaign. Cities attacked, populations targeted, but the mechanism is not military. Conventional weapons are stopped by walls. Armies are blocked by gates. The weapon error deploys passes through physical barriers without breaching them. It enters through doors, windows, and cracks, suggesting atmospheric penetration rather than physical assault. The people hiding in houses are killed not by soldiers entering, but by the weapon itself entering, as if it were a substance or condition that pervaded enclosed spaces. A second tablet complicates the interpretation. BM 422086, also from Nineveh, preserves a different section of the Error epic, describing the aftermath. The text states, "After Error had finished, he looked at what he had done. The cities were ruined, but the walls stood. The people were dead, but the corpses were not there. The fields were empty, but no graves were dug. Error said, 'I have made silence.' The gods returned and saw the silence. They asked, 'Where are the people who will bring offerings? Where are the cities that will call our names?' Marduk returned to Babylon and saw the silence. He wept." The passage is structured as divine regret, a common motif in Mesopotamian destruction narratives, but the details are specific. Walls stood, structures were not demolished, corpses were not there, populations died but left no remains. No graves were dug. Survivors did not perform burial rituals, either because no survivors remained or because conditions prevented burial. The text does not explain these details. It presents them as observable facts, consequences of Error's actions that even the gods find unsettling. The phrase, "I have made silence," is ashkunma kutu, from the verb shakanu, to place or to make, and kutu, silence or stillness. The term kutu is not the usual word for silence in Akkadian. That would be shalamu, the cessation of noise. Kutu implies stillness, the absence of activity or movement. Error does not claim to have silenced the cities by killing their populations. He claims to have made them still, to have stopped the processes that constitute life: movement, labour, speech, ritual. The distinction suggests that the destruction was not kinetic, not the result of shattering or burning, but something that halted function without obliterating structure. A parallel text, tablet VAT 9555, from the Berlin Vorderasiatisches Museum, contains a hymn to the god Ninurta, describing his weapons. The hymn is earlier than the Error epic, dating to the Old Babylonian period, but shares structural elements. Ninurta, like Error, is a warrior god whose victories are cosmic rather than merely military. The hymn lists his weapons: the mace that shatters mountains, the bow that pierces the sky, the net that captures winds, the weapon that consumes without eating. The final entry uses the verb akalu, to eat or to consume, in the negative. Gishtukul sha la ikalu, weapon which does not eat. The verb akalu is used throughout Akkadian to describe fire consuming fuel, animals consuming food, or disease consuming flesh. A weapon that consumes without eating is a weapon that destroys without the process of destruction. No residue, no remains, no physical transformation of matter from one state to another. The text does not explain what such a weapon does. It only categorizes it alongside Ninurta's other implements, treating it as one item in an arsenal of divine tools, each defined by a specific function. A third parallel, tablet IM 67564, in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, preserves a section of the Anzu myth, a composition describing Ninurta's battle against the bird demon Anzu, who stole the Tablet of Destinies. The text describes Ninurta preparing for battle. He took up his weapons, he took the mace, he took the bow, he took the weapon that strikes from afar, that kills what it does not touch, that leaves no mark. The phrase is Gishtukul Shah Inaruki Imahashu Shah La Ikamasu Imat, literally, weapon that from far strikes, that without touching kills. The grammar is precise. The weapon acts at distance, kills without physical contact, and produces death without visible injury. The description is not metaphorical, it is technical, defining the weapon's operational characteristics, range, mechanism, and effect. The text does not describe how such a weapon works, only that it exists within the divine arsenal and functions according to these parameters. The question is how to interpret these descriptions. One approach treats them as mythological fantasies, literary devices designed to emphasize the gods' overwhelming power by attributing to them capabilities that transcend human experience. Under this interpretation, divine weapons are hyperbolic versions of real weapons, bows that never miss, maces that shatter mountains, fire that cannot be extinguished. The exaggeration is the point, establishing the gods as categorically superior to humans. This interpretation is coherent and widely accepted. It allows the texts to be read as theology rather than documentation, as expressions of belief rather than claims about physical reality. But the interpretation requires assuming that the scribes who composed these texts, and the audiences who heard them, understood the descriptions as symbolic. It requires assuming that phrases like fire that burns without wood, or weapon that kills without touching, were recognized as impossible, and that the impossibility was deliberate, a way of signaling divine nature rather than human nature. The difficulty is that Mesopotamian scribes were trained in precision. Their administrative texts documented grain to the selah, labor to the day, distances to the cubit. Their lexical lists catalogued thousands of terms, distinguishing types of wood, types of clay, types of beer, with technical specificity. When those same scribes composed literary texts, they used a different register, poetic, formulaic, elusive, but they did not abandon precision. The descriptions of divine weapons are not vague, they are specific. They define operational characteristics, range, penetration, persistence, effects on structures versus effects on populations. The specificity suggests that the descriptions were not meant as generalized metaphors for divine power, but as categorizations of different types of force, each with distinct properties. Whether those categories described real phenomena, observed or inherited through memory, or whether they described imagined phenomena designed to fill explanatory gaps, the texts treat them as technical knowledge, information that required documentation and transmission. A final text shifts the frame. Tablet BM 47529, part of the Sipar Library collection, contains a ritual instruction for protecting a city during crisis. The ritual is structured as a series of offerings and incantations performed by priests at the city gates. One section instructs, if the enemy approaches with the weapon that does not touch, place at the gates offerings of pure water and white bread. Recite the incantation to Shamash 7 times. The weapon will turn aside. The phrase is identical to the phrase used in the Anzu myth, Kakusha la ikammasu, weapon that does not touch. But here it appears in a ritual context, not a mythological one. The ritual assumes that such a weapon might be deployed by human enemies, not only by gods, and that ritual countermeasures exist. The text does not describe what the weapon is or how it operates. It assumes that the priests performing the ritual will recognize it when it approaches, and that the prescribed offerings and incantations will provide protection. The ritual was not theoretical. It was copied in multiple versions, found at multiple sites, indicating widespread use. Scribes treated it as functional knowledge, a procedure to be followed when specific conditions occurred. What kind of weapon would priests recognize as the weapon that does not touch? And why would they believe that offerings of water and bread at the city gates would provide protection? The ritual logic is consistent with Mesopotamian theology. Gods mediate between human action and cosmic forces, and proper ritual performance can redirect divine will. But the ritual is addressed to Shamash, the sun god, not to Marduk or Enlil, or the deities typically associated with warfare. Shamash governs justice, truth, and illumination. His role in the ritual suggests that the weapon in question was understood as something related to light, sight, or exposure, forces within Shamash's domain. Whether the ritual ever worked, whether the weapon it addressed ever appeared, the text does not say. It only preserves the fact that Mesopotamian ritual specialists believed such a weapon existed, could be deployed, and required specific countermeasures distinct from the countermeasures used against conventional military threats. The question is not whether the weapon was real. The question is what experiences or inherited knowledge led scribes to develop vocabulary, categorization, and ritual responses for something they described as a weapon that kills without touching, burns without fuel, and penetrates walls without breaking them. In 1881, Johann Strassmayer published a collection of astronomical tablets from Babylon in Zeitschrift für Assyriologie, including one catalogued as SP2143, a fragment from the British Museum's Sipar collection. The tablet is an astronomical diary, a genre of text produced continuously by Babylonian scholars from the 8th century BCE until the 1st century CE, documenting daily observations of celestial phenomena. The diaries recorded lunar phases, planetary positions, weather conditions, market prices, and significant political or social events. They were compiled by temple astronomers, primarily at Babylon and Uruk, as part of a long-term project to identify patterns correlating celestial events with terrestrial outcomes. SP2143 preserves observations from the month of Abu, year 7 of Cambyses II of Persia, corresponding to July 522 BCE. Most entries follow standard format. Day 3, the moon was 2 cubits in front of Jupiter. Day 5, Saturn was in the region of Leo. Day 8, thin clouds, rain in the afternoon. Then, on day 11, the format breaks. Day 11, at dawn the sky was white, not blue, and remained white until the sun rose. The sun rose but gave little warmth. By midday the air was dark, though no clouds were seen. Birds were seen falling. The people said this was the day of An. No transactions in the market. The entry is longer than typical diary entries, more descriptive, and includes a phrase, the day of An, that does not appear elsewhere in the astronomical diary corpus. An is the Sumerian name for the sky god, the highest deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon. The day of An implies a day when the sky god manifested directly, a day when celestial phenomena were understood as divine presence rather than natural occurrence. The entry ends with a social observation. Markets did not function. The implication is that the atmospheric conditions were severe enough to halt economic activity, not by decree, but by popular response. The phrase, "the sky was white, not blue," is precise. The scribe distinguished between absence of colour and presence of white, not grey, which would indicate clouds, but white, suggesting diffuse light without the blue refraction typical of clear atmosphere. The sun rose but gave little warmth, indicates that the sun was visible, but its thermal effect was diminished. The air was dark, though no clouds were seen, is more difficult. Darkness typically results from cloud cover, but the scribe explicitly states no clouds were observed. The darkness, therefore, was not occlusion of the sun, but a quality of the air itself. Perhaps particulate density, perhaps atmospheric composition, something that reduced visibility without blocking the sky. Birds were seen falling is stated as observable fact, not as omen or metaphor. Birds fell, were seen falling, indicating sudden incapacitation or death of avian populations in numbers large enough to be noticed and recorded by an astronomer whose primary focus was celestial, not terrestrial phenomena. A second text provides linguistic context. Tablet BM 35115 plus 35383. A composite text reconstructed from fragments excavated at Babylon contains a section of the Enuma Anu Enlil series, the master compilation of celestial omens developed over the 2nd millennium BCE. Enuma Anu Enlil originally consisted of 70 tablets, cataloguing lunar, solar, planetary, and meteorological phenomena, each paired with predictions derived from centuries of observation and correlation. Tablet 50 of the series deals with solar eclipses and anomalous solar phenomena. One entry reads, "If the sun rises and the sky is the colour of the white stone, if the warmth does not increase, if the air becomes thick, there will be deaths among the people. The king's court will be in uproar. Messages will not arrive. The land will become silent." The entry describes the same cluster of phenomena documented in the astronomical diary from 522 BCE. White sky, diminished warmth, thick air. But the Omen tablet adds predictions: deaths, communication breakdown, political disruption, silence. The correlation suggests that the phenomena had been observed before, multiple times, sufficiently often that patterns of consequence could be derived and encoded in the Omen compendia. The phrase, "the land will become silent," echoes the language of lamentation literature: cities that cease functioning, populations that cease activity, administrative systems that cease recording. The Omen treats this outcome as predictable, a known consequence of specific atmospheric conditions. A third text, Tablet AO6478 in the Louvre, part of a collection acquired from southern Iraq in the early 20th century, preserves a prayer addressed to Shamash, the sun god, dated paleographically to the Neo-Assyrian period. The prayer is petitionary, asking the god for protection from a list of dangers, disease, enemies, wild animals, storms, and then, "the day when the sky burns but the ground does not warm, when the light is white and the air is heavy, when breath becomes difficult and the eyes see shadows." The prayer categorizes this condition alongside disease and storm, a natural threat requiring divine intervention. The phrase, "breath becomes difficult," suggests respiratory distress, an atmospheric quality that affects human physiology. "The eyes see shadows" might describe visual distortion, an effect of particulate density or atmospheric refraction that causes objects to appear indistinct or surrounded by halos. The prayer does not explain the condition. It assumes the worshipper will recognize the description and understand why protection is needed. The assumption indicates familiarity. This was not a rare or exotic threat, but a recurring one, common enough that prayers included it among standard petitions. A fourth text provides chronological distribution. During the 1960s, Abraham Sachs of Brown University compiled unpublished astronomical diaries from cuneiform collections across Europe and North America. His work, published posthumously in 1988 as Astronomical Diaries and Related Texts from Babylonia, included indices of unusual phenomena noted by the Babylonian observers. Sachs identified 17 entries across diaries spanning 747 BCE to 75 BCE that described variations of the phrase, "the sky was white," often paired with notes about diminished sunlight, darkened air, or disrupted weather patterns. The entries cluster: 4 during the 8th century BCE, 2 during the 7th, none during the 6th, 6 during the 5th, 3 during the 4th, 2 during the 3rd, none during the 2nd or 1st. The clustering suggests episodic recurrence, periods when the phenomenon occurred multiple times within a century, separated by periods of absence. The astronomical diaries were not literary compositions. They were scientific records, compiled continuously by professional observers whose purpose was to document patterns for predictive purposes. The presence of 17 entries describing anomalous white sky conditions across 7 centuries indicates that Babylonian astronomers witnessed, recorded, and attempted to interpret a recurring atmospheric phenomenon that did not fit their standard categories of weather, eclipse, or planetary event. A parallel line of evidence appears in Omen compendia dealing with weather. Tablet K 2894 plus 3753 from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh preserves a section of Enuma Anu Enlil dealing with wind and storm omens. One entry reads, "If the wind rises from the west and carries dust that is white like flour, if the dust falls on the fields and nothing grows, the harvest will fail, the people will scatter, the gods will not accept offerings." The entry distinguishes this dust from normal dust by colour, white like flour, and by effect, vegetation dies. Normal dust might bury crops or clog irrigation channels, but it does not kill vegetation on contact. The omen specifies that the dust itself, apart from burial, prevents growth, suggesting chemical or particulate contamination rather than mechanical occlusion. The predicted outcomes, harvest failure, population dispersal, cessation of ritual activity, match the patterns documented in administrative texts from the late Ur-3 period and described in lamentation literature. The omen connects specific atmospheric conditions with specific social collapses, treating the connection as causal rather than coincidental. A final text bridges observation and interpretation. Tablet VAT 1021-8 in the Berlin Vorderasiatisches Museum is a late Babylonian commentary on Enuma Anu Enlil, a genre of text that explains, elaborates, or reinterprets the omens in the Master series. The commentary addresses the entry about white dust from the west. It states, "The dust that is white like flour refers to the substance that falls when the gods open the windows of heaven. This is the substance that Enlil used against the cities of the south when he decreed destruction. It is called the dust of decision, because when it falls, the decision has been made and cannot be revoked." The commentary treats the dust not as metaphor, but as a specific substance, named, categorized, and associated with historical precedent, the cities of the south, a phrase that in Mesopotamian texts typically refers to the cities of Sumer, Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Larsa, Lagash. The term dust of decision is Gimel Simpti in Akkadian, from Gimlu, decision or decree, and Simptu, dust or ash. The commentary claims that this substance was used by Enlil in past destructions, and that its appearance indicates irreversible divine judgment. Whether the commentary reflects historical memory, theological interpretation, or scribal speculation, it demonstrates that late Babylonian scholars believed in the existence of a destructive atmospheric substance, associated it with specific past events, and treated its appearance as a predictable omen of catastrophe. The belief was not fringe or isolated. The commentary was copied, preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal, and transmitted alongside the authoritative Omen series it explained. Mesopotamian scholars took the white dust seriously enough to develop vocabulary for it, correlate it with outcomes, and encode it in the intellectual traditions that governed how kings and priests interpreted signs from the sky. The question is not whether the dust existed in the form the commentary describes. The question is, what atmospheric phenomena occurred with sufficient frequency and severity that scholars developed a technical vocabulary, observational protocols, and interpretive frameworks to understand them, and why those frameworks consistently linked specific atmospheric conditions to urban collapse, population dispersal, and the failure of agriculture, ritual, and governance. In 1958, Thorkild Jacobsen and Robert Adams published the results of the Diyala Basin Archaeological Project in Sumer, presenting surface survey data from southern Iraq collected between 1956 and 1957. Their work mapped site distributions across time periods and documented dramatic settlement pattern shifts during the late 3rd millennium BCE. One finding stood out. During the Ur-3 period, settlement density in the Diyala region was at its historical peak, with more than 200 documented sites showing occupation. In the subsequent Isin-Larsa and Old Babylonian periods, settlement density dropped to fewer than 80 sites, a decline of 60%. The abandoned sites were not destroyed. No burn layers, no fortification breaches, no weapon deposits. They simply ceased to be inhabited. But the survey also documented something environmental. Soil samples taken from 40 sites showing Ur-3 occupation revealed abnormally high sodium concentrations in the strata corresponding to the late Ur-3 and early Isin-Larsa periods. The salinization was not uniform across all sites, but it appeared at 31 of the 40, often at levels exceeding thresholds for barley cultivation. Barley tolerates salt better than wheat, surviving in soils where wheat cannot grow. But even barley has limits. Soil sodium levels above 0.4% by weight reduce yields dramatically. At levels above 0.8%, barley fails entirely. Samples from sites near ancient Ummah and Gersu showed concentrations reaching 1.2%, well beyond agricultural viability. The Jacobsen-Adams survey prompted further investigation. During the 1970s and 1980s, teams from the University of Chicago, the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, and Iraqi institutions conducted more detailed geoarchaeological studies across southern Mesopotamia. Their findings, published in various journals through the 1990s, confirmed the pattern. Rapid, severe salinization during the late Ur-3 period, concentrated in the southern plains but extending north into the Diyala and lower Euphrates regions. Thorkild Jacobsen's 1982 synthesis, Salinity and Irrigation Agriculture in Antiquity, argued that the salinization was anthropogenic, caused by irrigation practices that raised water tables, dissolved subsurface salts, and deposited them at the surface through evaporation. The process is well understood. Irrigation introduces water to fields. In arid climates, water evaporates rapidly, leaving behind dissolved salts. Over time, salt accumulates in the root zone, reducing fertility. If fields are not adequately drained or left fallow, salt concentration increases until crops fail. Jacobsen's model fit the Mesopotamian evidence. Cuneiform texts documented intensive irrigation, year-round agriculture, shortened fallow periods, and increasing pressure to maximize production, all factors accelerating salinization. The collapse of Ur-3 coincided with the moment when centuries of irrigation finally pushed salt levels beyond sustainable limits. But the model had a problem. Timing. Salinization caused by irrigation mismanagement is gradual, unfolding over generations as salt accumulates incrementally. Fields become less productive slowly, yields decline progressively, and farmers respond by shifting to more salt-tolerant crops, rotating fields more carefully, or eventually abandoning the most degraded land. The process is visible archaeologically as a slow contraction of settlement, not as rapid abandonment. Yet the settlement data showed rapid abandonment. More than half of Ur-3 sites in the Diyala region were deserted within a span interpreted as less than 50 years. Soil samples showed salt levels that should have taken centuries to accumulate, appearing in strata dated to a much narrower window. The discrepancy suggested that something accelerated the process, either intensifying the deposition of salt or compressing the time frame in which accumulation occurred. A clue appeared in the sedimentary record. Cores taken from sites near ancient Lagash and Gersu by British teams in the 1980s revealed an unusual stratigraphic feature. a thin layer, approximately 5 to 10 centimeters thick, of fine-grained sediment with exceptionally high sodium and sulfate concentrations, sandwiched between Ur-3 occupation layers and later Isin-Lhasa reoccupation layers. The sediment was not fluvial. It did not have the sorting and bedding structures typical of river-deposited material. It was not aeolian in the usual sense, not the coarse sand blown by desert winds, but fine dust, almost powdery, with particle sizes in the silt to clay range. The layer appeared at multiple sites across the region, always in the same stratigraphic position, always with elevated sodium and sulfate. Radiocarbon dates from organic material above and below the layer bracketed its deposition to the late Ur-3 or early Isin-Lhasa transition, consistent with the period of salinization documented in administrative texts. The layer suggested a single depositional event, a widespread dustfall or ashfall, occurring over a short period, potentially days or weeks, covering fields with a salt-rich sediment that poisoned soils immediately rather than gradually. A second clue came from textual evidence. Tablet CBS 1522 from Nippur, part of the University of Pennsylvania's early excavations, is an agricultural text dated to the 8th year of Ibi-Sin. The text records field inspections conducted by surveyors assessing crop conditions. The format is routine: field name, location, size, condition. Most entries state expected yields or note irrigation needs. Then, for 3 fields near the town of Guaba, the scribe wrote, "The fields are white, no seed has sprouted. The surveyors report the ground tastes bitter, no animals will graze. The fields are assigned to the goddess, for no man can work them." The phrase, "the fields are white," could describe salt crusting, a visible indicator of severe salinization, but the phrase, "the ground tastes bitter," is unusual. Surveyors tasted soil as a diagnostic technique, a way to assess salt content, clay composition, or contamination. Bitter taste indicates not only salt, but sulfate, a compound that imparts bitterness more strongly than sodium chloride. The combination, white appearance, bitter taste, animals refusing to graze, describes rapid, severe contamination, not the slow accumulation expected from irrigation-induced salinization. The final line, "assigned to the goddess," indicates the fields were withdrawn from production and dedicated ritually, a practice used for land considered irretrievably damaged or cursed. The tablet was routine bureaucracy, not lamentation or omen literature. It documented administrative response to environmental failure, using the dispassionate language of surveyors reporting observable facts. Another tablet, UM 55-21-354, from the University Museum, dated to Ibi-Sin's 21st year, recorded similar conditions at a broader scale. The text is a summary report from the governor of Umma to the central administration at Ur. It states, "In the fields of the south, the barley has failed. The fields that were green are now white. Water from the canal was drawn, but the plants died after drinking. The animals that drank from the canal became ill. 70 head of cattle died. The shepherds report the sheep will not drink. The people of 6 villages have moved north. I am writing to report that the fields of the south cannot be worked this year." The report is clinical, listing facts without interpretation. Water drawn from the canal killed plants and sickened animals. Livestock died in quantities significant enough to document. Populations moved, not as individuals but as entire villages. The governor concluded that the region was temporarily non-functional for agriculture, expecting that conditions might improve next year. No subsequent tablet from Umma confirmed improvement. The archive ceased shortly afterward. The environmental and textual evidence converges on a pattern. Rapid salinization, concentrated in the late Ur-3 period, affecting multiple regions simultaneously, severe enough to halt agriculture and displace populations within timeframes shorter than irrigation-induced salinization typically produces. The question is, what caused it? Jacobson's irrigation mismanagement model accounts for the presence of salt, but not the speed. An alternative model, proposed by geologists Karl Butzer and Peter McGee in the 1990s suggested that climatic shifts, prolonged drought combined with lower river flows, concentrated salts in irrigation water, accelerating deposition. The model fits some evidence. Lower river flows increase salinity in remaining water, and reduced rainfall means less leaching of salts from soils. But it does not explain the fine sediment layer documented in the cores, nor does it account for the textual descriptions of sudden contamination, fields turning white within a growing season, water sources becoming toxic abruptly, animals refusing to drink from canals that had been functional days or weeks before. A third model, less developed and more speculative, was proposed by Marie-Agnès Courty in a 1998 study of Bronze Age environmental crises in the Near East. Courty argued that evidence from multiple sites, including southern Mesopotamia, northern Syria, and the southern Levant, indicated widespread atmospheric disturbance during the late 3rd millennium, possibly linked to cosmic impact events or large volcanic eruptions. Her evidence included microscopic analysis of soil samples showing vitrified grains, shocked quartz, and spherules, features associated with high-energy events. The Mesopotamian samples she analysed came from Tel Leilan in Syria, not from southern Iraq, but she suggested that similar depositional events might explain rapid environmental collapse in regions where conventional explanations, drought, irrigation failure, climate change, did not fully account for the speed and severity. Courty's work was controversial, criticised for over-interpreting ambiguous microscopic features and for proposing catastrophic mechanisms without identifying specific events. No documented impact craters, no volcanic eruptions large enough to produce global effects during the relevant period. Her hypothesis remained marginal within Mesopotamian studies, cited occasionally but not integrated into mainstream reconstructions. Yet the question persists. The textual evidence describes fields turning white, water turning bitter, dust falling from the sky, air becoming difficult to breathe. Descriptions that appear in administrative documents, omen texts, lamentations, and prayers, composed over centuries by scribes working in different cities under different political regimes. The environmental evidence shows rapid salinization, fine sediment layers with elevated sodium and sulfate, occupation abandonment without destruction, and agricultural collapse on a regional scale. Conventional models, irrigation failure, climatic drought, economic mismanagement, account for gradual decline, not for the sudden breakdown described in the texts and documented in the archaeological record. The gap between the expected timeline of conventional processes and the observed timeline of collapse suggests that either the conventional models are incomplete or that additional factors, environmental, atmospheric, or otherwise, operated during the late Ur-3 period, factors that the texts describe but modern categories have not yet adequately named. In 1918, Samuel Langdon published a tablet from the University of Pennsylvania Museum, catalogued as CBS 1300-856, containing 47 lines of a previously unknown Sumerian composition. The text was identified as a city lamentation, a genre of poetry mourning the destruction of urban centres. CBS 13856 preserved a lamentation for the city of Ur, composed sometime after its fall at the end of the Ur-3 dynasty. The tablet was Old Babylonian in date, copied several generations after the events it described. Langdon's initial translation identified standard lamentation motifs: divine abandonment, enemy attack, population suffering, and supplication for restoration. But within the conventional framework, specific lines resisted easy interpretation. One passage stated, "The storm that was ordered against the city, the people could not see through it. It was not a storm of wind, not a storm of rain. It was a storm that devoured people. It entered houses, it rose from the fields. The day became dark, and the darkness was not night." Langdon translated the passage as hyperbolic description of military conquest, interpreting storm as metaphor for invading armies. The translation became standard in early Sumerological literature, and the text was cited as evidence of how Mesopotamian poets used natural imagery to describe warfare. In 1969, Thorkild Jacobsen published a new translation of the lamentation over the destruction of Ur in the Assyriological Studies series, working from a composite text reconstructed from 26 different manuscript sources. Jacobsen's translation revisited the storm passage, noting that the Sumerian term ugal does not simply mean storm, but refers specifically to violent atmospheric disturbance, hurricane-force wind, destructive weather, or overwhelming environmental force. The phrase ugurgal nu muundar padde, the storm that was not to be avoided, appeared multiple times in the lamentation, each time paired with descriptions that did not fit conventional weather. One section stated, "The storm carried fire, it mixed water with fire, it rose like smoke but was not smoke, it fell like rain but was not rain. What it touched died. What it did not touch also died. The cattle lay down in the fields and did not rise. The people who fled to the rivers found the rivers were gone. Those who remained in the city could not open their eyes from the burning." The descriptions are precise, distinguishing what the storm was not wind, not rain, not smoke, while struggling to articulate what it was. The text insists that the storm killed not only by direct contact, but by proximity, that it affected livestock and humans equally, and that its effects included burning sensations without visible fire. A second lamentation, the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Akkad, preserved in composite form from 13 manuscripts, describes similar phenomena. Tablet NI 4569, excavated from Nippur and held at the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, contains the best preserved version. One section reads, "Enlil called the storm from the mountain. Enlil brought the weapon that gives no escape. The weapon was fire, but it consumed no wood. The weapon was water, but it drowned no one. The weapon was wind, but it carried nothing away. It moved across the land. It entered Ur. It entered Eridu. It entered Uruk. The cities became silent. The people were piled in heaps. Their bodies melted like fat in the sun. The survivors wept, but there was no one to bury the dead." The passage pairs fire, water, and wind as aspects of a single weapon, each described in terms of what it did not do: fire that does not consume fuel, water that does not drown, wind that does not carry. The weapon's primary characteristic is not what it is, but what it causes: silence, mass death, bodily decomposition so rapid that survivors cannot perform burials. The phrase, "melted like fat in the sun," is rendered in Sumerian as igaz gin gud izia shubba, literally, like tallow on a fire thrown. The simile is visceral, specific, implying not decay but liquefaction, a process inconsistent with normal decomposition, which desiccates rather than liquefies remains in arid climates. A third lamentation, for the city of Eridu, preserved fragmentarily in tablet HS 1446 from the Hilprecht collection, adds another detail. The city was struck. No enemy entered. The walls stood, but the city was empty. The people were found dead in their houses, lying as if asleep, but their skin was black and their flesh was soft. The gods entered afterward and saw what had been done. They said, "This was the judgment. There will be no restoration." The city was left to the wind. The passage explicitly states that no enemy entered. The destruction was not military. Walls stood. The destruction was not kinetic. But the population died, and their bodies showed specific characteristics: blackened skin, softened flesh, postures suggesting sudden incapacitation. The god's pronouncement, "There will be no restoration," indicates permanent abandonment, a theological rationale for why the city was not rebuilt, even though its physical structures remained intact. The lamentation treats Eridu's fall as categorically different from other cities. Uruk, Ur, and Nippur were eventually restored. Eridu was not. The text offers no explanation for the distinction, only the assertion that divine judgment was final. The Lamentations were not composed immediately after the destructions they describe. They were composed later, during the Isin-Lhasa or early Old Babylonian periods, by scribes who may have had access to eyewitness accounts, archival records, or inherited oral traditions. The compositions follow strict generic conventions: divine decision, human suffering, divine regret, supplication for mercy. The structure is liturgical. The texts were recited in temples as part of rituals intended to prevent similar disasters or to mark anniversaries of past catastrophes. The question is, how much of the content reflects memory of events and how much reflects literary convention? The fire that consumes stone but not wood, the storm that was not wind or rain, the weapon that kills without touching. These descriptions recur across multiple lamentations, composed for different cities over a span of centuries. The recurrence suggests either that the descriptions are formulaic, borrowed from composition to composition as conventional expressions of overwhelming catastrophe, or that they describe a specific type of event, experienced at multiple sites, remembered and ritualized through repeated narration. A text from outside the lamentation genre provides a control. Tablet VAT 6018 in the Berlin Vorderasiatisches Museum is a royal inscription of Rim-Sin I, king of Lhasa, ruling around 1822 to 1763 BCE. Rim-Sin conquered multiple cities during his long reign, including Isin, Uruk, and finally Ur. His inscriptions describe military campaigns in conventional terms: armies mobilized, sieges conducted, walls breached, populations subdued. One inscription describes the conquest of Isin. I surrounded Isin, I blocked the gates, I cut off the water supply. The people surrendered. I entered the city. I took the king captive. I installed my governor. I restored the temple of Ninisina. The description is military, administrative, practical. There is no mention of storms, fire from heaven, or divine weapons. Rim-Sin claims divine sanction. Enlil gave me strength. But the victory is achieved through human agency, using conventional means. The contrast between Rim-Sin's inscription and the Lamentations is stark. When scribes describe military conquest, they use military vocabulary. When they describe the destructions lamented in the city lamentations, they use vocabulary drawn from theology, atmospheric phenomena, and environmental catastrophe. The difference suggests that the Lamentations are not simply poeticized accounts of warfare, but attempts to describe events that did not fit the military model, events that required a different explanatory framework. A final piece of evidence comes from the ritualization of the Lamentations. Tablets from Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian temple archives, dating to the 1st millennium BCE, include liturgical instructions for the performance of city lamentations during the Akitu festival, the New Year ritual performed annually in major cities. One instruction tablet, BM 34035, from the Babylon archives, specifies, on the 5th day of Nisanu, the Urigalu priests shall recite the lamentation for Ur in the courtyard of Esagila. Offerings of barley and beer shall be placed before the statue of Ningal. The recitation shall continue until the sun sets. The purpose is to prevent the return of the storm that devoured Sumer. The instruction is explicit. The recitation is apotropaic, intended to prevent recurrence. The phrase, the storm that devoured Sumer, is treated not as metaphor, but as a specific entity, something that occurred in the past and might occur again unless ritually averted. The ritual assumes that the storm is preventable through divine intercession, obtained by correct performance of offerings and recitations. The logic is consistent with Mesopotamian theology, but the content is specific. The Lamentations are not general prayers for protection from disaster. They are targeted rituals addressing a particular form of destruction, named, remembered, and believed to remain a threat centuries after the events they originally described. What kind of destruction requires liturgical prevention for more than a millennium after its occurrence? Military conquest does not. Conquered cities are rebuilt, their populations absorbed, their histories integrated into the narratives of the conquering state. Floods, earthquakes, and famines are mourned, but they are not ritualized as ongoing threats, requiring annual recitation of their memory. The city lamentations functioned differently. They were not simply memorials, they were active rituals, performed annually, intended to prevent the return of something the texts describe as the storm, the weapon, the fire that consumes stone, the judgment that leaves no restoration. Whether those descriptions preserve memory of specific historical events, or whether they embody collective anxiety about the fragility of urban civilization, the texts insist that the threat was real, had manifested before, and required continuous ritual vigilance to prevent its return. The question is not whether the rituals worked. The question is what the Mesopotamians believed they were preventing, and why that belief persisted long enough to embed itself in the liturgical calendar of cities that had never experienced the destructions the rituals commemorated. In 1914, Arno Perbel published a tablet from the Nippur collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, catalogued as NI 4486, containing a fragmentary Sumerian composition that he identified as belonging to the flood narrative tradition. The tablet was Old Babylonian in date, copied during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The text described the decision of the gods to destroy humanity with a flood, paralleling the flood narratives preserved in the Gilgamesh epic and the Atrahasis epic. But NI 4486 preserved a detail absent from the other versions. After describing the gods' decision, the text stated, "When the gods convened, they spoke in the language of before. They decreed the destruction in words that had been forgotten. The scribe who heard their counsel could not write their decree, for the words were old, and the signs were not known. What they decreed was spoken, but what was spoken was not written until later, when the words had been translated into the language that is now used." The passage is metatextual, acknowledging that the composition was not originally written in the language in which it was being copied. The language of before is presumably Sumerian, already a dead language by the Old Babylonian period, preserved only in scribal schools and religious contexts. But the passage implies something more, that even within Sumerian there existed linguistic strata, words that had been forgotten, signs that were not known, requiring translation into contemporary forms before the narrative could be written down. The phenomenon of textual transmission across linguistic and temporal gaps is well documented in Mesopotamian literature. Many of the great Sumerian compositions, epics, hymns, lamentations, were first written down during the Ur-3 or Isin-Lhasa periods, but they preserve language and themes that internal evidence suggests are older. The Sumerian king list references cities and rulers from the early dynastic period, centuries before the list was compiled. The Gilgamesh epic underwent continuous revision from early dynastic fragments through Old Babylonian versions to the standard Babylonian version preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. At each stage, the text was updated, linguistic archaisms clarified, narrative inconsistencies resolved, theological concepts reframed according to contemporary understanding. But the updates were not arbitrary. Scribes worked from older manuscripts, copying what they could read, restoring what they could infer, and noting where the original was damaged or unclear. Colophons, scribal notes at the end of tablets, frequently state, "written according to its original," or "copied from an old tablet, breaks not restored," or "the original was damaged, this line could not be read." The scribes understood themselves as transmitters, not authors, preserving texts whose origins lay beyond their direct knowledge. A second text illustrates the complexity. Tablet CBS 10996 from Nippur is a Sumerian hymn to the goddess Inanna, composed during the Ur-3 period, but preserving language identified by philologists as archaic even for that time. The hymn includes vocabulary that does not appear in contemporary administrative texts, grammatical constructions not used in other literary works of the period, and mythological references that are not explained within the text itself. One line reads, "Inanna descended to the place of decisions. She spoke the words of opening. The gates of the 7 walls were opened by the words. The words are written in the house of tablets, but they are written in the old writing, and the old writing is not read now." The passage refers to a set of ritual words, formulas used by Inanna to open the gates of the underworld, and specifies that those words were written down, stored in a house of tablets, an archive, but written in the old writing, a script no longer in active use. The phrase, "not read now," acknowledges that the knowledge encoded in those tablets was inaccessible to the hymn's contemporary audience. The hymn preserves the fact that the words existed, where they were stored, and why they could not be accessed, but it does not preserve the words themselves. The reference to the old writing likely indicates archaic cuneiform, the form of the script used during the early dynastic period, which differs significantly from the standardized Ur-3 script. Early dynastic cuneiform uses pictographic signs, complex ligatures, and polyvalent readings that later scribes found difficult to interpret without specialized training. By the Old Babylonian period, early dynastic texts were already antiquarian objects, collected and preserved in temple libraries, but rarely copied or translated. A catalogue of texts from the Nippur Library, Tablet 3NT 379, lists holdings by genre and period. One section lists tablets in the old script not read, numbering 47 items. The catalogue does not describe the content of these tablets, only their script and their status as unreadable. The preservation of unreadable texts is significant. The scribes who maintained the Nippur library did not discard tablets they could not read. They catalogued them, stored them, and passed them on to future generations, assuming that the knowledge encoded in the old script retained value, even if that value could not be accessed. The practice reflects an institutional commitment to preserving inherited material regardless of immediate utility, a form of cultural transmission that prioritizes continuity over comprehension. A third text complicates the picture further. Tablet IM 58045 in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad is a lexical list from the Old Babylonian period, part of the Easy series, a thematic vocabulary list used in scribal education. The list catalogues terms related to fire, burning, and heat. One section provides Sumerian terms in archaic script alongside the same terms in standard script with Akkadian translations. The format suggests that the list was designed to teach scribes how to read archaic cuneiform, enabling them to access older texts. One entry gives the Sumerian word gibil, fire, written first in early dynastic pictographic form, then in standard Ur-3 cuneiform, then with the Akkadian equivalent, ishatu. But the entry includes a gloss, a marginal note in smaller script stating, "This is the fire of the old time. Its name in the language of before was different, but that name is lost." The gloss acknowledges that the earliest linguistic form of the word is no longer known, that even the archaic Sumerian preserved in the list is not the original form, and that an earlier layer of language existed but was not recoverable. The implication is that Mesopotamian scribes understood their textual tradition as extending back beyond the reach of accessible records. They knew that the compositions they copied, the vocabularies they memorized, and the narratives they recited had predecessors, earlier versions, older forms, some of which could still be read with difficulty, others of which were lost entirely. The textual tradition was not a stable inheritance, but a reconstructed one, assembled from fragments, copied from damaged originals, translated from obsolete languages, and transmitted through generations of scribes who added, clarified, and occasionally misunderstood what they received. The process was neither careless nor cynical. It was methodical, institutionalized, and driven by the conviction that the texts mattered. that they contained knowledge essential to the functioning of temples, the legitimacy of kings, and the maintenance of order. But the process also introduced gaps, uncertainties, and layers of interpretation that make it difficult to determine where memory ends and reconstruction begins. A fourth text provides a concrete example. Tablet W23273 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin is a bilingual incantation, Sumerian text with Akkadian interlinear translation, used in rituals to purify buildings after fire. The incantation is Old Babylonian, but the Sumerian text includes archaisms that suggest it was copied from an earlier source. One line of the incantation reads, in Sumerian, Gibil anna ba'i'a ba'an tum tum. The fire from heaven came down and was brought repeatedly. The verb tum, to bring, is reduplicated, indicating repeated action. The Akkadian translation renders the line as Ishatu shame urdu itaklu. The fire from heaven descended and was finished. The Akkadian does not preserve the reduplication, suggesting that the translator did not understand the grammatical nuance or chose to simplify it. The Sumerian text specifies repeated bringing. Something came down not once but multiple times. The Akkadian text collapses the repetition into a single, completed event. The discrepancy is small but significant. It shows that even careful scribes, working with formal bilingual texts used in ritual contexts, could lose or alter details when translating from Sumerian into Akkadian. If this happened in ritual texts subject to strict preservation protocols, it likely happened more frequently in literary and historiographic compositions transmitted over longer periods. The question is what cumulative effect these small losses and alterations had on the compositions as a whole. When a lamentation describes fire that consumes stone but not wood, is that phrasing original? Or is it a later scribe's interpretation of a damaged or unclear original that described something more specific? When an omen text states that the weapon does not touch, is that a technical term preserved accurately across centuries? Or is it a scribal gloss explaining a term whose original meaning had been forgotten? The texts cannot answer these questions internally. They preserve only their final forms, the versions copied, recopied, and transmitted until they reached the libraries excavated by archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the colophons, glosses, and metatextual comments scattered through the manuscripts make clear that the scribes themselves understood the limitations of their knowledge. They knew they were working with inherited material, some of it damaged, some of it linguistically obscure, some of it referencing events and concepts no longer fully understood. They copied it anyway, trusting that preservation was more important than comprehension, and that future generations might recover meanings that had been lost to them. The result is a textual tradition that is extraordinarily rich and frustratingly incomplete, an archive of memory and reconstruction, where certainty about what the texts originally said and what the authors originally meant recedes the farther back one tries to reach. In 1902, French archaeologists excavating at Susa, the ancient capital of Elam in southwestern Iran, uncovered a black basalt stele standing 2.25 meters tall, inscribed with nearly 4,000 lines of Akkadian text. The stele, now housed in the Louvre and catalogued as SB8, contains the law code of Hammurabi, promulgated by the Babylonian king around 1755 BCE. The code is famous, one of the earliest comprehensive legal collections from the ancient world, covering property, family, commerce, and criminal law. But within the prologue, before the laws themselves, Hammurabi describes his accomplishments and the condition of Mesopotamia when he assumed power. He states, "When Anu and Enlil designated me to guide the people, to make justice appear in the land, to eliminate the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. When the gods called me, I restored the walls that had been abandoned. I reopened the canals that had been silted, I redistributed the fields that had been left fallow. I returned the people who had scattered. I made the cities speak again that had been silent. The phrasing mirrors the language of royal inscriptions from the Isin and Larsa dynasties, kings who ruled in the aftermath of Ur III's collapse. The description is not military. Hammurabi does not claim to have conquered enemies or expanded territory. He claims to have restored infrastructure, walls, canals, fields, and reversed demographic collapse. People had scattered, cities had been silent. The implication is that Hammurabi inherited a landscape still recovering from prior devastation, and that his legitimacy derived not from conquest, but from restoration. The laws themselves include provisions suggesting ongoing instability. Sections 27 through 31 address what happens to property when soldiers or administrators are captured or go missing during military campaigns. Section 27 states, "If a soldier or official is captured in the king's campaign, and afterward another man takes his field and orchard and carries on his business, if the first man returns and reaches his city, his field and orchard shall be returned to him, and he shall resume his business." Section 30 extends the provision. If a soldier or official abandons his field and orchard because of the obligation and flees, and afterward another man takes his field and orchard and carries on his business for 3 years, if the first man returns and claims his field and orchard, they shall not be given to him. The man who took them over and carried on the business shall continue to do so. The laws assume scenarios in which landholders disappear, captured, fleeing obligations, absent for years, and establish protocols for determining when absent ownership is forfeited and when it is retained. The provisions reflect a society where disappearance was common enough to require legal codification. Sections 48 through 52 address agricultural debt and disaster. Section 48 states, "If a man has a debt bearing interest, and the storm god Adad devastates his field, or the flood carries off the grain, or through lack of water grain has not been produced in the field, in that year he need not give grain to the creditor. He shall cancel his contract tablet, and need not pay the interest for that year." Section 52 extends the provision. If a man rents a field for cultivation, but does not produce grain in the field, they shall convict him of not performing the work in the field, and he shall give to the owner of the field grain in proportion to the adjacent fields. The laws distinguish between crop failure caused by environmental disaster, storm, flood, drought, and crop failure caused by negligence. Disaster voids debt obligations, negligence does not. The distinction assumes that environmental disasters occur frequently enough to require legal clarity about their economic consequences. The phrase, "the storm god Adad devastates his field," is specific. Devastation is attributed to Adad, but the legal consequence is economic relief, not ritual obligation. The law treats divine action as a category of risk equivalent to flood or drought, predictable enough to incorporate into contractual frameworks. A second legal text provides additional context. Tablet YBC 7173 in the Yale Babylonian collection is a collection of laws from the city of Eshnunna, predating Hammurabi's code by approximately 50 years. The laws of Eshnunna, as they are known, address similar issues: property, debt, family, criminal penalties. Sections 16 through 18 deal with field rental and crop failure. Section 17 states, "If a man rents a field and the renter does not cultivate it, and it lies fallow, he shall measure out 3 kur of barley per iku of field to the owner." Section 18 adds, "If the field has been devastated by the weapon, the renter and the owner shall divide the loss equally." The phrase, "devastated by the weapon," translates the Akkadian kaku iskipushi, literally, "the weapon has overwhelmed it." The term kaku, weapon, does not here refer to human warfare. It refers to a force of destruction personified as a weapon, comparable to the storm god Adad in Hammurabi's code. But the phrasing is different. Adad is named, the weapon is not. The capitalization in translation reflects the Akkadian grammar, where kaku appears without a determinative indicating a common noun, suggesting it is a proper noun, the weapon, a specific, recognized entity. The law treats devastation by the weapon as a shared risk between renter and owner, neither party fully responsible, both bearing the loss. The use of the weapon in a legal context indicates that Mesopotamian jurisprudence recognized categories of disaster distinct from warfare, flood, or famine. The law does not explain what the weapon is, how it devastates fields, or under what circumstances it appears. It simply assumes that judges, landowners, and renters will recognize when devastation was caused by the weapon and when it was caused by other factors. The assumption implies shared knowledge, a collective understanding of what the weapon does and how its effects differ from other forms of agricultural failure. The question is whether that shared knowledge was based on recurring experience, inherited memory, or theological tradition. The law cannot answer that. It only preserves the fact that Mesopotamian legal systems incorporated the weapon into contractual frameworks governing risk and compensation. A third text adds temporal depth. Tablet AO 8327 in the Louvre is a boundary stone from the Kassite period, approximately 5 centuries after Hammurabi, recording a land grant made by King Meli-Shipak II around 1186 BCE. Boundary stones, or kudurus, were inscribed with the terms of land grants and included curses invoking divine punishment on anyone who violated the agreement. The curses typically called upon the gods to inflict standard penalties: blindness, leprosy, military defeat, loss of heirs. But AO 8327 includes a curse not found in earlier kudurus. May Enlil strike him with the weapon that gives no escape. May his fields be devastated as the fields of the south were devastated in the time of silence. May his land become white and bitter, unfit for cultivation, dedicated to the gods, because no man can work it. The curse invokes not generic divine punishment, but a specific precedent: the fields of the south, devastated in the time of silence. Language that references the late Ur-3 collapse. The phrase time of silence echoes the king list's years without names, and the Lamentations' descriptions of cities falling silent. The curse assumes that the audience, landowners, judges, future readers of the boundary stone, will recognize the reference and understand that the invoked punishment is not hypothetical, but historically grounded. The fields of the south did turn white and bitter. Cultivation did cease. The land was dedicated to the gods because it became unworkable. The curse threatens to repeat those conditions, implying that whatever caused them once could be invoked again through divine will. The survival of this legal and contractual language across 6 centuries, from the laws of Eshnunna through Hammurabi's code to Kassite boundary stones, indicates that Mesopotamian legal tradition preserved memory of catastrophic agricultural collapse and incorporated that memory into frameworks governing property, debt, and divine sanction. The language remained specific: the weapon, the fields of the south, the time of silence, the land that turns white and bitter. The specificity suggests that the events were not mythological abstractions, but historical references, understood by contemporaries and transmitted to subsequent generations as precedents relevant to legal and economic relations. The question is not whether the events occurred. The laws and curses assume they did. The question is what the events were, how they were understood at the time, and why their memory remains sufficiently vivid to shape legal thinking for half a millennium. A final text shifts the frame. Tablet BM 78963, part of the British Museum's Babylon collection, is a late Babylonian legal document from the reign of Darius II of Persia, around 420 BCE, more than 13 centuries after the collapse of Ur-3. The document records a dispute over field ownership between 2 families in the region of Borsippa. The The plaintiff claims that the defendant's family had occupied fields that rightfully belonged to the plaintiff's ancestors, but had been abandoned during the Great Silence. The defendant argues that the fields had been legally transferred during the Neo-Babylonian period, and that any prior claims were voided by the length of occupation. The judges rule in favour of the defendant, stating, "The fields in question were abandoned during the time of silence, which occurred in the distant past. No records from that time exist. Occupation for more than 5 generations voids prior claims unless written documentation is provided." The phrase, "the time of silence," appears in a 5th century BCE legal document referencing events from the late 3rd millennium, a span of more than 1,500 years. The judges acknowledge the historical reference, but rule that the temporal distance makes verification impossible. The case is remarkable not for its outcome, but for the fact that litigants in the Persian period still invoked the time of silence as a legal precedent, and that judges recognized the reference even while ruling that it was too remote to adjudicate. The time of silence had become a chronological marker, a boundary in legal memory before which documentation did not exist, and after which new claims were established. The question is, what kind of event creates such a boundary, one so complete that it severs legal continuity, erases archives, and leaves a gap in the record that remains institutionally acknowledged more than a millennium later? Tablet BAM 159, part of the series Babylonisch-Assyrische Medizin in Texten und Untersuchungen, compiled by Franz Kircher, is a medical prescription text from the Neo-Assyrian period, copied during the 7th century BCE, but preserving much older material. The tablet is held in the British Museum, catalogued as BM 42272 plus 46493, a composite of 2 joining fragments. The text is organised as a diagnostic manual, listing symptoms followed by treatments. Most entries are conventional: fever treated with herbal infusions, wounds dressed with honey and oil, digestive complaints managed with dietary restrictions. Then, in the middle of the tablet, a section begins with a symptom cluster that does not fit standard disease categories. If a man's skin becomes dark without illness, if his flesh softens though he eats and drinks, if his eyes burn though no smoke is present, if his breath becomes difficult though his throat is not swollen, if he vomits blood though he has not been struck, this is the sickness of the weapon. No treatment will cure him, but his suffering can be reduced. The phrase, "the sickness of the weapon," is mursu kaki, using the same term kaku that appears in legal texts referring to agricultural devastation. The medical text categorizes it as a disease, not an injury, and specifies that it is incurable, distinguishing it from conditions that could be treated with herbs, surgery, or ritual intervention. The only treatment offered is palliative. Give him water with charcoal to drink to cleanse what is inside. Wash his skin with oil and cedar extract. Recite the incantation to Ninurta. He will die, but more comfortably. The symptom cluster is specific. Skin darkening without illness suggests discoloration not caused by infection or bruising. Flesh softening despite adequate nutrition suggests tissue breakdown at the cellular level. Burning eyes without smoke indicates irritation from non-visible particulate or chemical exposure. Difficult breathing without throat swelling suggests pulmonary distress not caused by infection. Vomiting blood without trauma indicates internal hemorrhage from non-mechanical causes. The symptoms do not correspond to any single ancient or modern disease, but resemble a syndrome caused by exposure to toxic substances, radiation, chemical agents, or particulate inhalation. The text does not describe the source of the exposure, only its effects and the futility of treatment. The inclusion of palliative care, water with charcoal, oil and cedar wash, recitation of incantations, indicates that physicians encountered this condition often enough to develop standardized responses, even though those responses could not prevent death. A second medical text provides additional detail. Tablet BAM 248, also from the British Museum, catalogued as K2443, is another diagnostic manual from the Neo-Assyrian period. One section addresses a condition referred to as the burning without fire. If a man's skin blisters though he has not been burned, if the blisters spread from his hands to his arms and from his feet to his legs, if the blisters break and the fluid that comes out is yellow, this is the burning without fire. Wash the blisters with water from a pure spring. Do not touch the fluid, for it will cause the burning to spread to the one who touches it. Cover the man with clean cloth. Keep him away from others. He will die within 7 days. The description matches chemical or radiation burns, blistering without external heat source, progression from extremities toward the torso, contaminated fluid capable of spreading the condition through contact. The isolation protocols, separating the patient, avoiding contact with fluid, using clean cloth, suggest that physicians understood the condition to be contagious or transmissible, not through airborne disease, but through direct contact with bodily fluids. The 7-day prognosis indicates that the condition followed a predictable course, familiar enough to medical practitioners that they could estimate time of death. A third text shifts from treatment to prevention. Tablet SPTU-1, 72, from the late Babylonian period, published in the series Spätbabylonische Texte aus Uruk, contains a ritual prescription for protecting against the air that kills. If a man sees that the sky has become white and the air is thick, he shall enter his house and seal the door and windows with wet cloth. He shall not go outside until 3 days have passed. He shall eat only bread and water, for the air outside will poison food left exposed. If he must go outside, he shall cover his face with cloth soaked in oil, and shall walk quickly, not pausing. If his skin begins to burn, he shall wash immediately with water from a clay jar, not from the canal, for the canal water will be poisoned. The instructions are practical, not theological. They describe observable conditions, white sky, thick air, and prescribe physical responses. Seal openings, cover face, avoid exposed food, use stored water rather than canal water. The logic is contamination control, consistent with understanding that the danger comes from atmospheric particulates or gases that infiltrate buildings, poison water supplies, and cause skin burns on contact. The 3-day duration is specific. Why 3 days? The text does not explain, but the precision suggests empirical observation. Previous events lasted approximately 3 days, and waiting longer than 3 days was considered safe. The distinction between water stored in jars and water drawn from canals indicates awareness that contamination affected surface water but not sealed containers, implying that the hazard was particulate or chemical, settling into open water but not penetrating closed vessels. The instructions to cover the face with oil-soaked cloth suggests a rudimentary understanding of filtration. Oil would trap particulates more effectively than dry cloth. The advice to walk quickly and not pause suggests that exposure duration mattered, that shorter exposure caused less harm than prolonged exposure. These are not magical prescriptions. They are practical protocols based on observable cause and effect relationships, developed through repeated experience and transmitted as medical and ritual knowledge. A fourth text connects medical conditions to environmental events. Tablet BAM 399, catalogued as British Museum K 2389, is a composite diagnostic and prognostic text. One section addresses outcomes for survivors of mass casualty events. If a city is struck by the storm that devours, those who survive but were exposed will sicken within days. First, their eyes will burn, then their skin will darken, then they will vomit blood. Some will die quickly, within 10 days. Others will live but will be weak for the rest of their lives. Their children will be born weak or deformed. If a man survives and is still strong after 30 days, he will live, but he should not father children for 1 year. The text describes acute and chronic effects. Immediate symptoms, eye burning, skin darkening, hemorrhaging, followed by long-term consequences, persistent weakness, reproductive harm, teratogenic effects on offspring. The advice to delay reproduction for a year suggests awareness that whatever caused the condition had lasting effects on reproductive health, and that those effects diminished over time. The 1-year waiting period is precise, implying that it was derived from observation. Children conceived within a year showed abnormalities. Children conceived after a year did not, or showed fewer abnormalities. The phrase, "the storm that devours," connects the medical text to the lamentation tradition. The Lamentations describe the storm as a weapon deployed by the gods. The medical text describes its physiological effects on survivors. The connection suggests that the lamentation tradition was not purely theological, but was grounded in medical observation. The Lamentations describe the event, the medical texts describe the aftermath. The separation of the two genres allowed each to preserve different aspects of the same phenomena. Lamentations preserved narrative, causality, and theological meaning, while medical texts preserved symptomology, treatment protocols, and prognostic criteria. Together, they form a composite record, an event that caused mass death, recognizable symptoms in survivors, predictable timelines for acute illness, long-term health consequences, and reproductive harm spanning generations. A final text provides chronological context. Tablet W22729 in the Berlin Vorderasiatisches Museum is a prescription from the Old Babylonian period, several centuries earlier than most of the medical texts cited above. The prescription addresses the sickness that came after the cities fell. If a man is weak and his skin is loose, if his hair falls and his teeth loosen, if he bleeds from the gums without injury, give him milk mixed with crushed liver of sheep. Give him barley water with dates. Make him eat fat and honey. This sickness comes from the air that was poisoned when the cities were struck. Not all who breathed the air became sick immediately. Some became sick later, after the air had cleared. The treatment may help, or it may not, depending on how much of the air the man breathed. The symptoms, weakness, hair loss, dental problems, spontaneous bleeding, resemble chronic radiation sickness or heavy metal poisoning, conditions resulting from sublethal exposure to toxic substances. The prescription is dietary, focusing on nutrient-dense foods, liver for iron, fat for calories, honey for energy, suggesting that physicians understood the condition as a wasting disease that could be managed through nutrition, but not cured. The text's reference to the air that was poisoned when the cities were struck links medical observation to historical event, treating the poisoning not as ongoing endemic hazard, but as consequence of a specific past occurrence, when the cities were struck. The distinction between immediate sickness and delayed onset, some became sick later after the air had cleared, indicates awareness of latency periods, the interval between exposure and symptom manifestation. The acknowledgement that treatment might not work, depending on how much of the air the man breathed, reflects dose-dependent toxicity, a principle that modern toxicology confirms, but that ancient physicians articulated through clinical observation. Severity of outcome correlates with intensity of exposure. The question is not whether ancient physicians understood the mechanisms of radiation sickness or chemical poisoning in modern terms. The question is what they observed that led them to describe conditions involving exposure to poisoned air, latency periods, dose-dependent outcomes, reproductive harm, and incurability. Conditions that required medical documentation, ritual prevention, and protocols transmitted across centuries as essential knowledge for survival in a world where such events, though rare, remained possible. Tablet K3657, excavated from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and now held in the British Museum, preserves a section of the myth Era and Isham, a composition closely related to the Era epic, but structurally distinct. The text describes the Anunnaki, a group of deities associated with judgment, the underworld, and cosmic order. One passage reads, "The Anunnaki, the great gods, sat in assembly. They held the tablet of destinies. They listened to Era, who spoke of the noise of humanity. They listened to Marduk, who spoke of restraint. They debated. Then they rendered their decision. The decision was recorded. Once recorded, it could not be revoked. Era stood and took the tablet. He went forth to carry out the decision that had been rendered." The passage describes the Anunnaki as judicial rather than executive. They decide, they record, but they do not act. The action is delegated to Era, who implements the decision. The structure mirrors bureaucratic process. A council deliberates, reaches a decision, documents it, and assigns execution to an agent. The Anunnaki function as the council, Era as the executor. The phrase, "once recorded, it could not be revoked," is critical. The decision becomes irreversible not when it is made, but when it is written. The act of documentation finalizes the judgment, transforming deliberation into decree. The image of the Anunnaki holding the tablet of destinies places them within the administrative metaphor that dominates Mesopotamian theology. The tablet of destinies is not a book of prophecy, but a document of authority, the instrument through which divine will is formalized and enacted. Possession of the tablet grants the power to decree fate, to determine outcomes, to administer the cosmos. In several myths, the tablet is stolen. By Anzu in the Anzu myth, by Kingu in the Enuma Elish, and the theft precipitates cosmic crisis. Order is restored only when the tablet is recovered and returned to its rightful holder. The myths do not describe the tablet as magical. They describe it as procedurally essential. Without it, decrees cannot be formalized, decisions cannot be enforced, and authority collapses. The Anunnaki's role as holders of the tablet positions them as cosmic administrators, whose function is to transform divine will into executed policy. They are not the source of the will. Enlil, Marduk, or other high gods propose actions, but they are the mechanism by which will becomes binding. A second text elaborates the Anunnaki's procedural role. Tablet Vat 10-174 in the Berlin Vorderasiatisches Museum is a hymn to Ninurta from the Old Babylonian period. The hymn describes Ninurta's preparations for battle against chaos. Before Ninurta went forth, the Anunnaki assembled. They examined the claim. They weighed the evidence. They consulted the records of previous actions. They determined that the claim was just. They authorized Ninurta to proceed. They affixed their seals to the decree. Ninurta received the decree and went forth. The passage describes judicial procedure. Claims examined, evidence weighed, precedents consulted, decisions authorized, seals affixed. The Anunnaki do not simply approve Ninurta's actions, they certify them through formal process, ensuring that what Ninurta does is legally and cosmically legitimate. The seals are critical. In Mesopotamian administration, a seal transformed a document from draft to official record, from proposal to decree. The Anunnaki's seals perform the same function cosmically. They certify that Ninurta's violence is not arbitrary but authorized, not chaos but enforcement of order. A third text connects the Anunnaki to the destructions described in lamentation literature. Tablet UM 2913-024 from the University Museum in Philadelphia is a fragmentary lamentation for the city of Nippur, dated paleographically to the Old Babylonian period. One preserved section reads, "The Anunnaki came to Nippur. They did not enter the city. They stood at the gates and pronounced judgment. They said, 'The decision has been rendered, the writing is completed, the city will be silent.' They departed. Then the storm came. The storm did not come from the Anunnaki. The storm came because the Anunnaki had pronounced judgment. The Anunnaki did not wield the storm, they authorized it." The passage distinguishes between decision and execution. The Anunnaki pronounce judgment, they authorize destruction. but they do not perform it. The storm comes because judgment was pronounced, implying causal relationship, but not direct agency. The Anunnaki function as judicial authorities whose pronouncements trigger execution by other forces, storm, weapon, fire, without themselves wielding those forces. The distinction is theological and also practical. If the Anunnaki are judicial rather than executive, then the destructions they authorize are not arbitrary violence, but cosmic law enforcement. The question shifts from, why did the gods destroy the cities, to, what violation required judicial response? The texts rarely specify violations. The Lamentations describe divine displeasure, human noise, general wickedness, but not specific crimes sufficient to justify total urban annihilation. The vagueness may be generic. Lamentation conventions do not require precise causality, or it may be evasive. Naming specific causes would invite questions about proportionality and divine justice. But the structure of the narratives is consistent. The Anunnaki convene, deliberate, decide, and authorize. Then, separately, destruction occurs. The procedure is bureaucratic, formalized, and irreversible once documented. A fourth text complicates the theology. Tablet K4623+6050 from the British Museum's Nineveh collection preserves a wisdom composition known as the Dialogue of Pessimism, a text in which a master and servant debate the value of various actions. One exchange addresses divine justice. Master: I will do good to my God. Servant: do so, Master. The man who does good to his God has his heart's desire granted. He multiplies good deeds and receives rewards. Master: no, servant, I will not do good to my God. Servant: do not do so, Master. You will teach your God to walk after you like a dog, demanding offering after offering, saying, you owe me service, or you owe me more. The exchange reflects theological skepticism. Doing good to the gods does not guarantee reward. Refraining from service does not necessarily provoke punishment. Then the dialogue shifts. Master: what is good? Servant: to have my neck and your neck broken, and to be thrown into the river, that is good. Master: no, servant. What is really good? Servant: no one knows. The Anunnaki know. They wrote it down. But where they wrote it, no one can say. The Tablet of Destinies is held in the place no one enters. What the Anunnaki decreed, we discover only when it has already happened. The servant's response is existential. Ultimate good is unknowable because the Anunnaki have documented it in a place inaccessible to humans. Fate is written, but the writing is hidden. Humanity experiences fate retrospectively. We discover only when it has already happened, without foreknowledge or input. The Anunnaki's administrative function renders them unknowable. They decide, they document, they authorize, but their deliberations are opaque. Humans are subject to their decisions without understanding the criteria by which decisions are made. A fifth text offers a rare glimpse of the criteria. Tablet SPTU-2-53 from late Babylonian Uruk is a ritual commentary explaining offerings made to the Anunnaki during the Akitu festival. The commentary states, the offerings to the Anunnaki are made because they judge between cities. They measure the weight of each city's righteousness against its unrighteousness. If unrighteousness is heavier, they decree silence. If righteousness is heavier, they decree prosperity. The offerings are made so that the judgment will be delayed, so that the city will have time to increase its righteousness before the judgment is rendered. The passage describes the Anunnaki as conducting moral accounting, weighing righteousness against unrighteousness, and rendering verdicts accordingly. The offerings are not bribes but procedural delays, ways of deferring judgment to allow time for corrective action. The theology is mechanistic. Cities accumulate righteousness and unrighteousness as quantities, the Anunnaki weigh them, and the balance determines the verdict. The process is impersonal, formulaic, and subject to procedural intervention. Offerings delay judgment, Rituals increase righteousness, but not to arbitrary reversal. Once judgment is rendered, it cannot be revoked. The question is how this theological framework relates to the destructions described in the Lamentations. If the Anunnaki weigh righteousness and unrighteousness, what unrighteousness did Eridu, Nippur, and the other cities commit that justified annihilation? The Lamentations do not answer. They describe the destructions as divinely decreed, but do not specify the causes. The silence might reflect theological modesty. Humans cannot question divine justice. Or it might reflect historical uncertainty. The scribes who composed the Lamentations centuries after the events did not know why the cities fell and could only assert that the gods had decided. But the framework persists. The Anunnaki administer fate. Their decisions are documented, and once documented, they are irreversible. The destructions were not chaotic, they were judicial. They were authorized by a council that weighed evidence, consulted precedent, and formalized their verdict in writing. The storm, the weapon, the fire, these were execution mechanisms, cosmic instruments deployed because the Anunnaki had decreed their deployment. What kind of civilization develops a theology in which catastrophic destruction is not random disaster, but bureaucratic procedure, in which annihilation requires documentation, and in which the gods responsible are not warriors but judges, not agents but administrators? And what does that theology preserve about the nature of the destructions it attempts to explain? In 1896, British explorer J. Theodore Bent published The Sacred City of the Ethiopians, describing his travels in Yemen and the traditions he recorded among the Himyarite and Sabaean populations. One tradition described the destruction of the ancient city of Marib, associated historically with the biblical Queen of Sheba. Bent's informants described an event in which fire came down from the sky and the city was consumed, but the fire left the stones standing and only the people were taken. The description echoes Mesopotamian lamentation language: fire from the sky, selective destruction, structures intact but populations gone. Bent recorded the tradition as local legend, noting that archaeological remains at Marib showed no burn layers consistent with conventional fire, yet the city had clearly been abandoned suddenly during the first millennium BCE. The correlation between the legend and the archaeological evidence suggested that the tradition preserved memory of an actual event, though Bent could not identify what kind of event would produce the described effects. A second parallel appears in the Hebrew Bible. Genesis 19 describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife, behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. The narrative specifies fire and sulfur from heaven, total destruction of inhabitants and vegetation, and an anomalous transformation, Lot's wife becoming salt. The phrase pillar of salt has been interpreted as metaphor, as etiological legend explaining natural salt formations near the Dead Sea, or as symbolic punishment for disobedience. But the narrative context is environmental catastrophe, not moral allegory. The destruction is physical, immediate, and overwhelming. Lot's family flees, is warned not to look back, and one who does is transformed. The transformation is not explained, only stated. The text does not moralize about it in the usual biblical fashion. No divine speech explaining the punishment, no narrator commentary on its justice. The transformation is simply part of the event, one consequence among others. Archaeological work in the Dead Sea region has documented widespread destruction of early Bronze Age sites around 2300 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with the late early dynastic period in Mesopotamia. Excavations at Bab ed-Drah, Numeira, and other sites revealed burn layers, collapsed structures, and evidence of sudden abandonment. Geophysical surveys identified possible impact structures